Welcome. Before we begin tonight's story, I have one question. Where are you listening from tonight? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoy falling asleep to these calm but chilling tales, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Now, close your eyes and let the forest take you. It was the morning of October 14th. The clock hadn't even chimed yet, but I had the feeling that everything was going wrong. The coffee tasted strange, and it was the kind of morning where the sun seemed to have forgotten how to rise, painting the sky in mismatched colors. I am Trevor Langdon, and I have been working as a park ranger at Joshua Tree National Park for 12 years. I learned that when my instincts start whispering to me that something is wrong, I need to pay attention. It was 6:47 a.m. when the call came in. I was sipping my second cup of strange coffee and reviewing the reports of the night's events when dispatch's voice crackled over my radio in that tone that makes every park ranger's body tense. Trevor, there may be a missing person at Hidden Valley Campground Site 42. There's a vehicle and a tent, but they didn't notify their camping companions as planned. Can you go check it out? I grabbed my gear without hesitation, that uneasy feeling in my stomach intensifying with each piece of equipment I clipped to my belt. The drive out to Hidden Valley took about 15 minutes, winding through those iconic Joshua trees that give this place its name, their twisted arms reaching toward a sky that was slowly bleeding from dawn pink into harsh desert blue. The temperature was already climbing, promising another scorcher of a day, where the rocks would shimmer with heat and tourists would underestimate how quickly dehydration could turn a pleasant hike into a medical emergency. Site 42 sat near the back of the campground, tucked against a cluster of massive granite boulders that offered some shade in the afternoon. As I pulled up, I could see the setup immediately told a story, and it wasn't one I liked. A silver Honda Civic with California plates sat parked at the designated spot, covered in a thin layer of that fine desert dust that settles on everything out here. Next to it stood a small two-person tent, properly staked and clearly inhabited, with a camp chair positioned outside and a small folding table that held what appeared to be notebooks and equipment cases. What struck me first, what made that knot in my stomach pull tighter, was how organized everything looked. This wasn't some inexperienced camper who'd wandered off unprepared. Someone had taken the time to set this up properly, had clearly planned to be here for more than just a quick overnight stay. But there was no movement, no sound except for the morning wind rustling through the creosote bushes and the distant call of a raven announcing the day. I approached slowly, announcing myself clearly, even though I could see no one around. "Park Ranger, anyone here?" My voice echoed slightly off the rock formations, coming back to me empty. I tried again, louder this time, and got nothing but that same hollow echo and the wind's response. The tent's zipper was closed but not locked, which was standard enough. I called out one more time before carefully opening it, following protocol even though every instinct told me I wouldn't find anyone inside. The tent's interior was neat, almost obsessively so. A sleeping bag lay rolled and secured, a backpack sat in one corner with its contents visible through the open top, clothing folded and organized. A small camp pillow, a headlamp hanging from the tent's ceiling loop, a water bottle 3/4 full. Everything you'd expect from someone who knew what they were doing out here. But no person, and more importantly, no signs of panic or hurried departure. Whoever had been staying here had left in an organized fashion, or at least that's what the scene suggested. I backed out and turned my attention to the table outside. This is where things started getting interesting, where that professional curiosity that makes someone good at this job began mixing with something closer to concern. Spread across the small camping table were 3 spiral notebooks, their pages filled with handwritten notes and sketches. Next to them sat what I recognized as a decent telescope, still on its tripod and pointed toward the western horizon. A star chart, the professional kind you can buy at astronomy shops, lay partially unrolled and held down by a smooth river rock. And there, right in the center of the table, was a piece of paper that would end up changing everything about this case. It was standard printer paper, the kind you could buy at any office supply store, but what was on it definitely wasn't standard. Someone had hand-drawn an incredibly detailed star map, using what looked like a fine-point pen and a steady hand. The precision was remarkable. Dozens of points connected by careful lines, creating patterns and clusters that should have represented constellations. Should have, but didn't. I've spent enough nights out in this desert, away from light pollution and under skies so clear you feel like you could reach up and touch the Milky Way, to recognize the major constellations. What was drawn on this paper didn't match anything I'd ever seen. The points were marked with varying sizes, suggesting different star magnitudes, just like a real star chart. Some were circled. Others had small notations next to them in handwriting so small I had to squint to read them. Numbers, mostly, but also abbreviations I didn't immediately understand. At the bottom of the page, written in that same careful hand, were the words, October 13th, 11:47 p.m., observation complete. Going to verify coordinates. I pulled out my phone and snapped photos of everything, making sure to capture the overall campsite layout, the tent interior, the table setup, and especially that strange star map. Then I started going through the notebooks, careful not to disturb the scene too much, but needing to understand what I was dealing with. The first notebook appeared to be a research journal, filled with technical notes about stellar positions, right ascension and declination coordinates, proper motion calculations, stuff that was way above my pay grade, but clearly the work of someone who knew their astronomy. The second notebook was more personal, almost like a diary mixed with field notes. I flipped to the most recent entries dated over the past 3 days. The writer, who I was assuming was our missing camper, had documented their arrival at Joshua Tree, their excitement about the dark sky conditions, their plans for nightly observations. The entries were enthusiastic, full of that kind of passion that comes through even in hurried handwriting. But the tone shifted on the last page, dated October 13th, the previous night. The patterns are wrong, it read. I've checked my calculations 3 times, verified against multiple catalogs, even recalibrated the telescope. But what I'm seeing doesn't match what should be there. It's like someone took the familiar constellations and shifted them, just slightly, just enough to notice if you're really paying attention. The angles are off by fractions of degrees, but consistently across multiple star systems. I need to document this properly. I need to verify these coordinates in person, trace the sight lines from different positions in the park. If I'm right, if there's actually something causing this discrepancy, it could be significant. Heading out to checkpoint 3 at midnight. Should be back by 3 a.m. The entry ended there, mid-thought almost, as if the writer had been interrupted or simply couldn't wait any longer to start their verification process. I checked my watch, 7:15 a.m. If they'd left at midnight planning to be back by 3, we were now more than 4 hours past their expected return time. The desert morning was already heating up, and anyone who'd been out hiking through the night without proper preparation could be in serious trouble. I radioed back to dispatch, giving them a detailed rundown of what I'd found. We've got a likely missing hiker, female, based on the clothing in the tent and the handwriting style. Appears to be an astronomy student or researcher. Left the campsite around midnight last night with plans to return by 3 a.m. Left behind a detailed but unusual star map and notes about verifying coordinates. I'm going to need SAR mobilized and a positive ID on who's registered to this campsite. Dispatch acknowledged, and got to work on their end while I continued my assessment of the scene. The third notebook was the most technical, filled with mathematical equations and coordinate systems that might as well have been ancient Greek to me. But tucked between the pages were printouts from various astronomy websites and academic papers about stellar cartography, proper motion of stars, and something called astrometric anomalies. Someone had been doing serious research before coming out here. I checked the vehicle next. Locked, but through the windows I could see a purse on the passenger seat, a university parking permit hanging from the rearview mirror. UC Berkeley, which tracked with the level of academic work in those notebooks. The back seat held more camping gear, all organized and packed efficiently. A cooler, presumably with food and more water. A larger backpack that looked like it might be for day hikes. Everything suggested someone who'd planned this trip carefully, who knew what they were doing in the backcountry. Dispatch came back with an ID about 20 minutes later. Campsite registered to Holly Traynor, 23 years old, graduate student in astrophysics at UC Berkeley. She checked in 3 days ago, paid for a week-long stay. Her emergency contact is listed as Professor Richard Martinez at the university. We're trying to reach him now. Also, her roommate called the campus police this morning when Holly didn't respond to texts or calls, which is apparently unusual for her. They contacted us. Holly Traynor. Now the missing person had a name, an identity, a life that people were worried about. I stood there in the growing heat, looking at her carefully organized campsite, her detailed research notes, that impossible star map, and tried to piece together what might have happened. The logical part of my brain, the part that's solved dozens of missing person cases over the years, started running through the standard scenarios. Lost hiker who misjudged the terrain or time. Medical emergency forcing her to seek help in the wrong direction. Animal encounter, though those are rare and usually leave more obvious signs. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, a fall in the dark. But that star map kept drawing my attention back. There was something about it, something that felt important beyond just being a quirky detail in a missing person case. The precision of it, the confidence in those pen strokes, suggested someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And that note, about the patterns being wrong, about needing to verify coordinates in person, hinted at something that had driven Holly Traynor out into the desert night with enough urgency that she couldn't wait until morning. I photographed the university parking permit, got the license plate number, and started a more thorough search of the immediate area around the campsite. Looking for footprints, for signs of which direction she might have headed, for anything that would give me a starting point for a search pattern. The problem with desert terrain is that it doesn't hold tracks well unless you hit patches of soft sand, and the wind that's almost constant out here can erase what evidence does exist within hours. About 30 feet from the campsite, near a gap between two large boulders, I found something. A partial footprint in a small patch of sand, the tread pattern matching the hiking boots I'd seen neatly placed inside Holly's tent. The direction pointed northwest, toward some of the more remote sections of the park. I marked the location with a small flag from my pack and continued the search pattern, finding 2 more partial prints heading in the same general direction before the rocky terrain swallowed any trace. My radio crackled again. "Trevor, we've got SAR teams mobilizing. Should be at your location within 30 minutes. Also, made contact with Professor Martinez at Berkeley. He confirms Holly Traynor is his graduate student. Says she came out to Joshua Tree specifically to do stellar observations for her thesis work. He's concerned, but not surprised, she went out for night observations. Says it's typical behavior for her when she's in research mode. He's sending us her emergency medical information and a more recent photo." "Copy that," I responded. "I've got a likely direction of travel heading northwest from the campsite. Requesting aerial support if available, and I want to get ground teams moving on this search pattern as soon as they arrive." Time is not on our side here. Even as I said it, I was calculating in my head. If Holly had left at midnight and it was now past 7:30 a.m., she'd been out there for over 7 hours. The night had been cool, which was good, but the temperature was climbing fast and would hit the 90s by noon. If she was injured, if she was without water, every minute mattered. I went back to the campsite and took one more careful look at that star map, this time really studying it. The more I looked, the more I realized how complex it was. This wasn't just random dots on paper. The spacing, the clustering, the way certain points were emphasized, it all suggested a very specific thing being documented. And those coordinates mentioned in the notebook, the talk about verification points, made me think Holly had been planning to physically go to specific locations to observe the sky from different vantage points. In the back of my mind, a question was forming that I couldn't quite articulate yet. What could make the stars appear to be in the wrong positions? What could cause the kind of discrepancy that would drive a graduate student in astrophysics to abandon a safe campsite in the middle of the night? And more pressingly, where had that search for answers led Holly Traynor? The SAR teams started arriving, experienced volunteers and Park Service personnel who'd spent hundreds of hours training for exactly this kind of situation. I briefed them on everything I'd found, showed them the footprint trail heading northwest, distributed copies of Holly's photo that had just come through from the professor. We divided into teams, each taking a sector, and began the systematic search pattern that's saved countless lives in these situations. I took the lead team, following that northwest direction where the footprints had pointed. The terrain here is challenging, a mix of sandy washes and boulder scrambles, punctuated by those distinctive Joshua trees and clusters of cholla cactus that can tear up unprotected skin in seconds. It's beautiful country, the kind of stark desert landscape that draws people from all over the world, but it's unforgiving to mistakes. One wrong step in the dark, one moment of inattention, and a pleasant hike becomes a survival situation. We spread out in a line, maintaining visual contact with each other while covering as much ground as possible. My eyes scanned constantly, looking for any sign of passage, any disturbed vegetation, any piece of equipment that might have been dropped. The sun climbed higher, the temperature with it, and I found myself thinking about Holly's notebooks, about her careful preparations, trying to use what I knew about her to predict where she might have gone. Checkpoint 3, that's what she'd written. But checkpoint 3 of what? Not any official park designation, so it had to be something from her own research plan. I radioed the teams, asked if anyone had seen any kind of markers or signs that might indicate observation points. Negative responses came back from all sectors. Whatever system Holly had been using to organize her observations, it wasn't obvious to casual searchers. 2 hours into the search, Team 3 radioed in with a possible sighting. They'd found what looked like a recently used rest spot under an overhanging rock face about 1.5 miles northwest of the campsite. Scuff marks where someone had sat. A small area of disturbed sand that suggested someone had set down equipment. I redirected to their position, hope and concern mixing in equal measure. When I arrived, I could see what they meant. Someone had definitely been here, and recently enough that the signs were still clear. The overhang would have provided good cover, a place to set up equipment and make observations. I crouched down, examining the area more closely. There, in the sand, were more boot prints, the same tread pattern I'd seen near the campsite, and next to them the distinctive circular impression of a telescope tripod leg. She was here, I confirmed to the team. This could be her checkpoint 3 or maybe just a waypoint on the route to it. I looked around, trying to think like someone hunting for specific stellar coordinates. From this position, you'd have a clear view to the west and northwest, unobstructed by the taller rock formations that dominated other parts of the park. It was a smart choice for observations. But there was something else that caught my attention. Scratched into the rock face, barely visible unless you were looking for it, was an arrow. Not old petroglyphs from ancient inhabitants, but fresh marks made with something sharp, probably a rock or a piece of metal. The arrow pointed further northwest, deeper into the park's backcountry. And next to it, scratched in those same fresh marks, was the number 3, with a question mark. Holly had been here, had made these marks, and then continued on. The question mark suggested uncertainty, like she wasn't sure if this was actually her intended checkpoint 3 or if she needed to go further. I photographed the marks and reported to the other teams. We were on the right track, but it was also clear that Holly had gone deeper into the backcountry than anyone had initially expected. The search continued, now focused on the trajectory suggested by that arrow. The terrain got rougher, the spaces between recognizable landmarks greater. This was the part of Joshua Tree that most day hikers never saw, the remote sections where you could go hours without seeing another person. It's what makes this place special, that sense of genuine wilderness, but it's also what makes search and rescue operations so challenging. By noon, we'd covered nearly 3 miles from the original campsite with no further signs of Holly. The heat was becoming a serious factor now, the temperature pushing past 95 degrees, and we had to rotate team members regularly to prevent them from becoming casualties themselves. Water consumption was heavy. First aid supplies were being tapped for minor scrapes and heat exhaustion symptoms. If Holly was out here without adequate water, without shade, she was in critical danger. I called for a brief regroup, gathering the team leaders to reassess our strategy. We had a direction. We had evidence of Holly's passage, but we were running out of daylight hours before we'd need to suspend the active search until morning. The thought of Holly spending another night out here, possibly injured, possibly without water, was gnawing at me. That's when Team 5 radioed in with something that changed the entire dynamic of the search. They'd found another marker, this one much more elaborate than the simple arrow at the first checkpoint. It was a cairn, a stack of rocks deliberately placed and balanced, sitting on a flat boulder outcrop about 2 miles northwest of the last known location. And next to the cairn, weighted down with smaller rocks to prevent the wind from taking it, was a piece of paper. I reached their position in record time, my heart pounding from exertion and anticipation. The cairn was definitely recent, the rocks still showing moisture underneath where they'd been pulled from the cooler sand below. The paper was another hand-drawn map, but this one was different from the star chart back at the campsite. This was a topographical map of the surrounding area, showing rock formations, elevation changes, and 3 points marked with X's. Each X had a notation next to it: CP1, baseline, CP2, verification, and CP3, convergence point. Holly had been working from a planned route all along, specific locations chosen for specific observational purposes, and based on the map, we were currently at what she'd marked as CP2, which meant CP3, her final destination, was still ahead of us. But there was something else on this map, something that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Holly had drawn lines connecting the 3 checkpoint locations, and in the exact center of the triangle formed by those lines, she'd written, Epicenter, 2.3-degree offset confirmed. Pattern consistent across all observation points. This is real. I stared at those words, trying to make sense of them in the context of a missing person search. What was real? What pattern? And why had confirming it been important enough to drive her this deep into the backcountry? I radioed dispatch, gave them our new position and the information about CP3. We need to push toward this final checkpoint location. Based on this map, it should be approximately 1 mile northwest of our current position. If Holly made it there, that's where we'll find her. The team pushed on, energized by this concrete lead, but also increasingly worried about what we might find. The terrain here was particularly rugged, a maze of boulder piles and narrow canyons that would be treacherous even in daylight. Attempting this route at night, even with a good headlamp and moonlight, would have been extremely dangerous. One wrong step, one loose rock, and a simple observation hike could become a tragedy. We found CP3 about 40 minutes later, and the scene there was both illuminating and disturbing. Holly's telescope sat abandoned on its tripod, still pointed toward the sky even though the stars it had been aimed at were long since erased by the harsh daylight. Next to it lay her backpack, contents partially spilled, a water bottle empty and lying on its side. Papers covered with more calculations and notes were scattered around, some held down by rocks, others starting to curl in the dry heat. But no Holly, no signs of where she might have gone from here. The observation point was positioned on a high outcrop that offered 360-degree views of the surrounding landscape. It would have been perfect for stellar observations, but it was also completely exposed, no shelter from the elements, no shade to escape the sun. If Holly had stayed here into the morning, the heat would have become unbearable quickly. I approached the scattered papers carefully, trying not to disturb the scene more than necessary while also desperately searching for clues about what had happened here. The notes were frantic, the handwriting deteriorating from the careful precision I'd seen in the camp notebooks into something hurried and excited. "The convergence is visible from here," one page read. "All 3 sight lines intersect at coordinates." And then a string of numbers that meant nothing to me. Another page had a sketch, rough and quick, showing what appeared to be sight lines extending from 3 points, meeting at a central location. And at that central point, Holly had drawn a circle and written, "Physical location of epicenter, approximately 3 miles SW of CP3, must verify in person, must see what's there." My stomach dropped. She'd gone further. After setting up this observation point, after making her calculations and confirming whatever pattern she'd been tracking, Holly had decided to physically go to the location where all her sight lines converged. At night, across some of the roughest terrain in the park, and based on the direction she'd indicated toward an area that was officially off-limits to hiking due to dangerous conditions. I got on the radio immediately, updating dispatch and requesting additional resources. We needed to expand the search area significantly, push into territory that was rarely accessed, and we needed to do it fast. The clock was ticking. Holly had now been missing for over 12 hours, and every hour decreased the chances of finding her alive and well. While coordinating the expanded search, I took a moment to really look at the scene Holly had left behind. Her telescope, expensive equipment just abandoned, told me she'd left in a hurry or with the intention of returning quickly. The scattered papers suggested she'd been working right up until the moment she left. And the empty water bottle was concerning. It meant she'd likely left here with little to no water for what would have been a 3-mile trek across difficult terrain. One of the SAR team members, a veteran named Marcus who'd been doing this for 20 years, came up beside me and looked at the scene. "I've seen a lot of missing person situations," he said quietly, "but this is one of the stranger ones. Usually when someone abandons this much equipment, it's because they're panicking, running from something real or imagined. But this," he gestured at the organized chaos of papers and notes, "this looks like someone who found exactly what they were looking for and couldn't wait to confirm it." He was right. There was an energy to this scene, a sense of excitement and urgency that came through even in the abandoned equipment and scattered notes. Holly Traynor hadn't left here in panic. She'd left here with purpose, driven by something she'd discovered in her observations, something that was important enough to make her throw caution to the wind and push deeper into dangerous territory. The question that haunted me as we prepared to continue the search was simple but troubling. What could an astronomy student possibly have seen in the stars that would make her take such risks? What was at that epicenter location that was worth abandoning safety protocols and emergency planning? And where was Holly Traynor now? The expanded search began immediately, but organizing a push into the restricted southwestern section of the park required coordination with higher-ups and additional safety protocols. While that machinery ground into motion, I made a decision that probably violated about 6 different regulations. I took 2 experienced team members, Sarah Green and Mike Rodriguez, and we started moving toward Holly's indicated epicenter location. Not an official search deployment, just 3 rangers doing reconnaissance to assess the terrain for the incoming SAR teams. That's what I told myself anyway. The truth was simpler and more desperate. Every minute we spent organizing and coordinating was another minute Holly was out there alone. If she was injured, if she was dehydrated and disoriented, waiting for perfect protocol could mean the difference between rescue and recovery. Sarah and Mike understood without me having to explain. They'd both been doing this long enough to know when rules needed to bend. We moved fast, using Holly's rough map and our combined knowledge of the terrain to plot the most direct route. The landscape here was treacherous, a chaos of fractured granite and hidden crevasses that could swallow an unwary hiker. Joshua trees grew sparse this far out, giving way to creosote bush and patches of bare rock that radiated heat like griddles. The temperature had peaked at 98 degrees, and even with regular water breaks and decades of experience between us, the conditions were pushing our limits. About a mile into the trek, Sarah called out and pointed toward a gap between 2 massive boulder formations. Footprint, fresh enough to still show detail. We converged on the spot, and sure enough, there was Holly's boot tread pressed into a small patch of sand that had been sheltered from the wind. The print was deep, suggesting someone moving quickly, and the direction aligned perfectly with the bearing toward her epicenter coordinates. She came through here within the last 12 hours, Mike confirmed, examining the print's edges. Probably closer to 8 or 9 hours ago, before the morning wind really picked up. That timeline matched what we knew. Holly leaving CP3 sometime in the early morning hours while it was still dark. Moving fast, moving with purpose, but moving through extremely dangerous terrain with inadequate light. We pressed on, finding more intermittent tracks where the terrain allowed. Each print was a small victory, confirmation we were on the right path, but also a reminder of the risk Holly had taken. This wasn't hiking terrain. This was scrambling and climbing country, places where you needed both hands and absolute concentration. Doing this at night bordered on suicidal. The radio crackled with updates from the main search coordination. Additional teams were mobilizing, a helicopter was being redirected from another operation, and Holly's professor from Berkeley was now in direct contact with Search Command, providing information about her research and state of mind. Apparently, Holly had mentioned in recent emails that she was onto something significant with her observations, but hadn't elaborated on what that meant. 2 miles from CP3, we hit a section that stopped me cold. A narrow canyon, maybe 15 feet wide at the top and narrowing as it dropped down into shadows. The only ways around it added at least an hour to the route. But going through it, climbing down one side and up the other was technical and dangerous. In daylight, with proper equipment, it would be challenging. At night, with just a headlamp and climbing alone, it would be nearly impossible. No way she went through there, Sarah said, already scouting for an alternate route. But Mike was leaning over the edge, looking down into the canyon, and something in his posture made me join him. About 12 feet down, wedged into a crack in the rock face, was a piece of fabric. Blue fabric, the same shade as the lightweight jacket I'd seen in Holly's tent. My heart rate spiked. We need to get down there now. Mike was already unpacking rope from his kit, setting up an anchor point around a sturdy boulder. The descent was quick and controlled, training and adrenaline working together to get me to that fabric in under 2 minutes. As I got closer, I could see it was indeed a piece of jacket, torn and caught on the rock. But no Holly, no body, no blood. Just the torn fabric and, more troubling, the clear signs that someone had been through here. The canyon floor was shadowed and cooler, a relief from the brutal sun above. I searched the immediate area while Sarah descended to join me, Mike staying topside to maintain radio contact with the main search effort. The canyon ran roughly east to west, and boot prints in the sandy floor showed Holly had continued westward after making it through this obstacle. More concerning were the scuff marks on the canyon walls, evidence of a difficult descent and what looked like at least one fall or slip. "She made it through," I called up to Mike, "but she definitely took some hits doing it," continuing west through the canyon. Sarah and I moved quickly through the passage, following the boot prints and occasional blood spots that suggested Holly had cut herself at some point during the climb. Not enough blood to indicate a major injury, but enough to add another layer of concern to an already critical situation. The canyon opened up after about 200 yards, spilling us out onto a rocky plateau that stretched toward a distinctive rock formation in the distance. 3 spires of stone, reaching up like fingers toward the sky, the kind of geological feature that becomes a natural landmark. And according to Holly's map, her epicenter coordinates put the location somewhere near the base of those spires. "That's got to be it," Sarah said, pointing toward the formation. "That's where she was heading." We reported our position and findings to Mike, who relayed them to Search Command. The main SSAR teams were still at least an hour behind us, working through the terrain with the caution that proper search operations demanded. But we were here now, within striking distance of where Holly had been going, and there was no way I was waiting. The approach to the spires took another 30 minutes of hard hiking, the terrain rocky and unstable. But as we got closer, I started noticing something strange. The rock formations around us, the natural features of the landscape, they seemed to have a pattern to them. Not the random chaos of geological processes, but almost like they were positioned deliberately, creating sight lines and alignments that felt intentional. I mentioned it to Sarah, who gave me a look that suggested the heat might be getting to me. But then she stopped, looking around more carefully. "You're right," she said slowly. "These formations, the way they're positioned, it's like someone set up markers, but that's impossible. These are millions of years old." "Not someone," I replied, pieces clicking together in my head. "Something, natural formation, but in a pattern," and Holly noticed it. That's what her research had been about, what she'd been documenting with such urgency. Not just star positions, but the relationship between celestial observations and physical landmarks. She'd found some kind of alignment, some connection between the sky above and the earth below, and it had led her here. We rounded a final cluster of boulders, and there, at the base of the 3 spires, we found Holly Traynor. She was sitting with her back against the stone, legs stretched out in front of her, head tilted back and eyes closed. For one terrible moment, I thought we were too late, that we'd found a body instead of a rescue. But then I saw her chest rise and fall, shallow but steady breathing, and relief flooded through me so intensely I almost stumbled. "Holly!" I called out, rushing forward with Sarah right behind me. "Holly, can you hear me?" We reached her position, and I immediately began assessment while Sarah got on the radio to call in the find. Holly's skin was hot and dry, textbook heat exhaustion pushing toward a heat stroke. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, suggesting severe dehydration, but she was alive, and that was what mattered. Her eyes fluttered open at the sound of her name, unfocused at first but gradually finding me. "You found it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. The map was right. The epicenter, it's real. Her hand lifted weakly, pointing toward the base of the central spire where the stone met the ground. Look at the rocks, look at the pattern. I glanced where she was pointing, while Sarah worked on getting water into Holly in small, careful sips. The rocks at the base of the spire were covered in something, markings that at first glance looked like natural weathering patterns. But the more I looked, the more I realized Holly was right. There was a pattern, a deliberate design carved into the stone, not ancient petroglyphs, but something else entirely, something that looked almost like a map or diagram. The stars, Holly continued, her words coming with difficulty. They line up with these markings, perfect correlation. 3 observation points, 3 spires, all pointing to this location. Someone made a map, wrote it in the sky and on the ground. I had to see it, had to confirm it was real. Her eyes closed again, exhausted from even that brief explanation. Sarah had the medical kit out now, taking vitals and starting treatment for heat-related illness. She's in bad shape, Trevor. We need to get her out of here fast, get her to proper medical care. But moving her in this heat, across that terrain we just came through, it's risky. The radio crackled with updates. The main SAR team was closing in on our position, and the helicopter had been cleared to attempt a pickup from the plateau we'd crossed earlier. Can you stabilize her for transport to the plateau? I asked Sarah, who was already working on that exact plan. Mike had descended from the canyon and was making his way toward us, bringing additional medical supplies and water. With 3 of us working together, we could get Holly to that plateau and meet the helicopter, have her on the way to the hospital within the hour. But even as we organized the rescue, even as I watched Sarah and Mike work with efficient precision to save Holly's life, my mind kept going back to what she'd said. The stars lining up with ground markings, a map written in sky and stone, observation points that had to be perfect to see the correlation. It sounded like the excited ramblings of someone suffering from heat exhaustion and dehydration, the kind of confusion that comes with that condition. Except Holly's research, her careful documentation, her methodical approach to finding this place, none of that suggested confusion or delusion. She'd found something, seen something in her astronomical observations that had led her to this specific location, and the markings on the stones, they were real, visible, undeniable. Whatever Holly had discovered, it wasn't a heat-induced hallucination. We got her stabilized enough to move, carefully lifting her with an improvised stretcher made from Mike's jacket and 2 sturdy branches Sarah had cut from a nearby Joshua tree. The journey back to the plateau was slow and careful, every step measured to avoid jostling Holly more than necessary. She drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally mumbling about coordinates and alignments, about patterns that shouldn't be possible. The helicopter arrived just as we reached the plateau, its rotors kicking up dust and noise that made communication difficult. The flight medic jumped out with a proper stretcher and took over Holly's care with practiced efficiency. I gave him a quick rundown of her condition and how long she'd been exposed while Sarah provided the medical details from her assessment. Within minutes, Holly was secured in the helicopter and lifting off, headed for the nearest hospital capable of treating severe dehydration and heat-related injuries. As the helicopter disappeared into the distance, the 3 of us stood on that plateau, exhausted and sunburned and running on adrenaline fumes. The main SAR teams were arriving, ready to help with cleanup and site documentation. But the emergency was over, the missing person was found, and the immediate crisis had been resolved. "Hell of a rescue," Mike said, taking a long drink from his water bottle. "But I've got to say, I'm curious about what she found out there. Those markings on the rocks, the way she was talking about patterns and alignments. What do you think it means?" I didn't have an answer for him. The rational part of my brain, the part trained in search and rescue and emergency response, wanted to dismiss it as the confused thoughts of someone suffering from environmental exposure. But I'd seen Holly's research, her meticulous documentation, the precision of her star maps and calculations, and I'd seen those markings at the base of the spire with my own eyes. I think, I said slowly, that Holly Traynor found something that made her throw caution to the wind and risk her life to verify. And I think whatever it is, it scared her as much as it excited her. The question is what we do with that information. Sarah looked at me seriously. We write it up in the incident report, document everything we found, and let smarter people than us figure out what it means. Our job was to find her and bring her back safely. Mission accomplished. She was right, of course. We were rangers, not scientists or researchers. Our expertise was in wilderness survival and emergency response, not in decoding mysterious alignments between stars and stones. But as we packed up our gear and started the long hike back to the main search staging area, I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd stumbled onto something significant. Something that had been out here in this desert for who knows how long, waiting for someone with the right knowledge and tools to notice it. And Holly Traynor, driven by scientific curiosity and the thrill of discovery, had found it. The aftermath of the rescue was the usual organized chaos. Debriefings with search coordinators, documentation of the entire operation, coordination with hospital staff monitoring Holly's recovery. She was in serious but stable condition, the doctors said, should make a full recovery with proper hydration and rest. Her professor from Berkeley was flying in to be with her, and her family had been notified and were on their way. I spent the rest of that day filling out paperwork and giving statements. The bureaucratic side of emergency response that's less dramatic but just as necessary. But my mind kept wandering back to that site at the base of the 3 spires, to those markings on the rocks and Holly's insistence that they aligned with stellar positions. Before I left the station that night, I made copies of all the photographs I'd taken, including the detailed shots of Holly's star maps and the markings at the epicenter location. 2 days later, I got a call from the hospital. Holly was awake and asking to speak with me, wanting to thank the rangers who'd found her and brought her back. I drove down during my day off, partly out of professional courtesy, partly because I had questions that only she could answer. She looked remarkably better, color back in her face, and an IV providing the hydration her body desperately needed. Her hands were bandaged where she'd cut them during her canyon descent, and she moved stiffly from muscles pushed beyond their limits. But her eyes were sharp and alert, the eyes of someone whose mind was already racing ahead even while her body recovered. "Ranger Langdon," she said, as I entered her room, her voice still rough but stronger than it had been at the rescue site. "Thank you. I'm told if you hadn't pushed ahead of the main search teams, if you'd waited for proper protocols, I probably wouldn't have made it." She said it matter-of-factly, without drama, just stating what the doctors had told her. "You're welcome," I replied, taking the chair next to her bed. "Though, I have to say, as rescues go, yours was one of the more unusual ones. Not many people end up in life-threatening situations because they were chasing astronomical observations." I kept my tone light, non-judgmental, but I was watching her reaction carefully. Holly smiled slightly. "Yeah, it wasn't my finest moment in terms of decision-making. Professor Martinez has already given me a lengthy lecture about safety protocols and not letting research enthusiasm override common sense. He's right, of course. I put myself at serious risk and forced a lot of people to come looking for me. I'm genuinely sorry about that. But you found what you were looking for," I said, pulling out my phone and bringing up the photos of the markings at the spire base. "These patterns, the alignments you were documenting, You seemed pretty convinced they were significant, even when you were barely conscious from heat exhaustion. Her eyes lit up when she saw the photos, that unmistakable look of a researcher seeing confirmation of their theories. You photographed them, thank you. I was worried I wouldn't have any documentation since I left my equipment behind. She studied the images intently, even asking me to zoom in on certain sections. They're real, Ranger Langdon. The correlations I found between stellar positions and these ground markings, they're mathematically precise. Too precise to be coincidence. Explain it to me, I said, genuinely curious now. What exactly did you find out there? Holly took a breath, organizing her thoughts. You know how ancient cultures built structures aligned with celestial events. Stonehenge with the solstices, Mayan pyramids with Venus observations, Egyptian pyramids with Orion's belt. This is like that, but different. The markings at that location, they correlate with current stellar positions. Not positions from thousands of years ago, but now, today. And the precision required to create that kind of alignment, it's remarkable. Could it be a modern creation? I asked. Someone in the last few decades who knew astronomy and decided to leave their mark? She shook her head. That was my first thought too. But the weathering on those markings, the way they're integrated into the stone, suggests they're much older. Maybe centuries, maybe longer. Which raises the question of how whoever made them could have known about stellar positions that wouldn't be visible from that location until now, accounting for proper motion and stellar drift over time. I sat back, processing that information. So you're saying someone created a map that wouldn't be accurate until the 21st century, and we're just now seeing it activate, basically? I'm saying the evidence suggests that possibility, Holly corrected carefully. Which sounds impossible, I know. It violates what we understand about how ancient cultures approached astronomical observation. But the data is there, documented and photographable. Professor Martinez is bringing a team out next month to do a proper survey of the site. Whatever it is, it deserves serious academic study. We talked for another hour, Holly explaining her research methodology and how she'd identified the initial discrepancies that led her to Joshua Tree in the first place. It was fascinating stuff, the kind of mystery that sits at the intersection of archaeology, astronomy, and human curiosity. But what struck me most was Holly's genuine scientific excitement about it, even after it had nearly cost her life. Will you go back? I asked as I was getting ready to leave. To the epicenter location when you've recovered? She smiled. With proper safety protocols, adequate supplies, and during daylight hours, absolutely. There's too much there to document, too many questions to answer. But I'll be more careful next time. The universe's mysteries aren't going anywhere, and I can't study them if I'm dead from heat stroke. I left the hospital with my head full of questions and a growing fascination with what Holly had discovered. Back at the station, I filed my final reports on the incident, including all the photographic evidence and Holly's statements about what she'd been researching. Standard protocol for unusual findings during search operations, though I suspected this particular report would generate more interest than most. A week later, I got clearance to return to the epicenter site during my regular patrol rotation. Not to disturb anything or interfere with the academic survey that was being planned, but to see it again with fresh eyes and without the urgency of a rescue operation clouding my judgment. I made the trek alone this time, properly equipped and with full safety notifications filed with dispatch. Standing at the base of those 3 spires in the middle of a clear desert day, I could see what Holly had been so excited about. The markings were extensive, covering a section of rock face about 15 feet wide and 10 feet high. They looked like a combination of geometric patterns and symbolic representations, circles and lines and shapes that did seem to correlate with the sky above, when I pulled out Holly's star maps for comparison. But more than that, there was something about the site itself, about standing in that exact spot with those formations around me, that felt significant. Not in a mystical or supernatural way, but in the way certain places have gravity, importance, the weight of purpose. Someone had chosen this location carefully, had created something here meant to last, meant to be found. I took measurements, documented the site extensively, and added everything to the growing file on Holly Trainor's discovery. When the academic team arrived the following month, I made sure to brief them thoroughly on the terrain and conditions, using Holly's rescue as a cautionary tale about the dangers of working in this environment without proper support. The story could have ended there, an interesting footnote in Joshua Tree's history, and a dramatic rescue that gave everyone involved a good story to tell. But the universe, as Holly would probably say, had other ideas. 3 months after Holly's rescue, I got a call from Professor Martinez at Berkeley. His team had completed their initial survey of the epicenter site and had found something that expanded the mystery considerably. The markings Holly had discovered weren't isolated to just that one location. Using ground-penetrating radar and other survey techniques, they'd found evidence of similar markings at locations throughout the park, all positioned in precise geometric relationships to each other. "It's a network," Professor Martinez explained over the phone, his excitement palpable even through the distance. "At least 7 distinct sites that we've identified so far, maybe more. All with similar markings, all positioned in alignment with both celestial observations and each other. Someone created a massive astronomical observation network out there, and Holly stumbled onto the epicenter of it." "How old?" I asked, the question that had been bothering me since Holly first mentioned the weathering patterns. There was a pause. "That's where it gets weird, Ranger Langdon. The geological analysis suggests the markings are at least 200 years old, possibly more. But the astronomical alignments they represent, accounting for stellar motion and proper motion over time, those only became accurate within the last 50 years. It's like someone 2 centuries ago created a map for us to find today." The implications of that statement hung in the air. I wasn't a scientist, didn't have the background to fully understand all the complexities involved. But I understood enough to know that what Holly had found challenged some fundamental assumptions about what was possible with pre-modern technology and knowledge. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now? Now the real work begins. We're applying for grants to do a comprehensive survey of the entire area, bringing in specialists in archaeoastronomy, geology, indigenous history. Whatever this is, whoever created it, they left us a puzzle that's taken 200 years to reach the right moment to be solved. And Holly gets to write her dissertation on being the person who found it." After we hung up, I sat in my office at the ranger station, looking out at the desert landscape I'd worked in for over a decade. How many times had I driven past those sites, hiked near those formations, without realizing there was something remarkable hiding in plain sight? It made me wonder what else was out there, what other mysteries were waiting for someone with the right knowledge and perspective to notice them. Holly made a full recovery and did indeed write her dissertation on the epicenter network, as the academic community started calling it. Her work drew attention from researchers around the world, all wanting to study this astronomical puzzle left in the California desert. The Park Service, to their credit, worked with the academic community to preserve and protect the sites while allowing legitimate research to continue. I stayed in touch with Holly over the following years, watching from a distance as her discovery opened up new questions about ancient astronomical knowledge and the sophistication of pre-modern observers. She never forgot that her scientific triumph had nearly cost her life, and she became a vocal advocate for proper safety protocols and field research. As for me, I kept doing my job, patrolling Joshua Tree's backcountry and helping visitors experience the park safely. But I looked at the landscape differently now, aware that beneath the surface beauty and geological drama, there might be other stories waiting to be discovered, other messages left by people who understood the stars in ways we're only beginning to appreciate. The lost star map that Holly Trainer created that night at her campsite, the one that started this whole adventure, ended up in a university archive. A reminder of how scientific curiosity and human determination can lead to remarkable discoveries. And sometimes, it leads rangers like me on searches that end up revealing more than just the location of a missing person. They reveal the deep connection between earth and sky, between ancient knowledge and modern understanding, between the human need to map our place in the universe and the eternal patterns of stars wheeling overhead. Out there in the desert, someone centuries ago looked up at those same stars and decided to leave us a message. And Holly Trainer, driven by curiosity and armed with modern tools, was the one who finally read it. The thing about the desert that most people don't understand until they spend real time out here is the silence. Not the absence of sound, because there's always sound if you listen close enough. The whisper of wind through creosote bush, the distant call of a raven, the subtle crack of stone expanding in the heat. No, what I'm talking about is the quality of that silence, the way it presses against your eardrums and makes you hyper-aware of your own breathing, your own heartbeat, the blood moving through your veins. It's the kind of silence that makes people uneasy, makes them talk too loud or play music from their phones, anything to fill that vast empty space with something familiar. I'm Sadie Morales, been a ranger at Joshua Tree National Park for going on 16 years now, and I've learned to love that desert silence. It's honest in a way that human noise never is, doesn't pretend to be anything other than what it is. Out here, the land doesn't care about your problems, your fears, your need for comfort. It just exists, patient and eternal, wearing away under sun and wind at a pace that makes human lifespans look like eye blinks. The morning of March 8th started like most others during early spring at Joshua Tree. Cool enough that I needed a jacket for my first patrol rounds, but with that promise of heat already building on the eastern horizon. I was checking the backcountry trails, the ones that see less traffic than the popular tourist spots, but attract the serious hikers, the ones who come out here looking for something beyond Instagram photos and gift shop souvenirs. These trails wind through some of the more remote sections of the park, places where cell service is non-existent and the nearest help might be hours away, even if you could call for it. I was about 6 miles into the Boy Scout Trail, a 12-mile route that cuts through classic Joshua Tree landscape, all twisted trees and boulder piles and that peculiar desert architecture that looks designed by someone with a surrealist's eye. The trail was in good condition, no major washouts from the recent rains, no obvious hazards that needed flagging for hikers. Just another routine patrol on another clear desert morning, or so I thought. That's when I saw it, maybe 20 feet off the trail, partially hidden behind a cluster of barrel cactus. A water jug, the large kind hikers carry for long desert treks, sitting upright like someone had carefully placed it there before walking away. That immediate wrongness registered before my conscious mind caught up. You don't just leave water in the desert. Water is life out here, the difference between finishing your hike tired and satisfied or becoming a statistic in a search and rescue report. I approached carefully, already running through possibilities in my head. Could be someone lightening their load. Maybe they brought too much and decided to cache it for the return trip. Could be trash, though that seemed unlikely given how deliberately it had been positioned. Could be a marker. Some hikers leave supplies at intervals for long-distance treks. Or it could be something worse. Something that made my ranger instincts start pinging alerts. The jug was a standard 2-gallon container, the kind you can pick up at any outdoor store, blue plastic with a black handle. Still about 3/4 full based on the weight when I lifted it, which deepened my concern. Nobody abandons that much water unless something's gone very wrong. I looked around for other signs, any indication of who might have left it or why, and that's when I saw the boot prints. They were clear in a patch of sand near where the jug had been sitting, the distinctive tread of hiking boots, men's size, based on the dimensions, probably a 10 or 11. The stride length suggested someone tall, maybe 6 feet or more, walking with purpose, but not running. The prints led away from the trail, heading northwest into rougher terrain where the sandy washes gave way to more rocky ground that wouldn't hold tracks as well. I marked the location with a GPS waypoint and took photos of the jug and the prints, standard protocol for anything unusual found in the backcountry. Then I radioed dispatch. "Morales here. I've got a possible situation on the Boy Scout Trail, approximately 6 miles in from the western trailhead. Found an abandoned water jug, still mostly full, and boot prints heading off trail to the northwest. Requesting permission to follow and assess." Dispatch came back after a brief consultation with my supervisor. "Copy that, Morales. You're cleared to investigate, but maintain regular check-ins. We'll have a second unit start heading your way as backup. ETA about 45 minutes. Be careful out there." I acknowledged and started following the prints, moving slowly and methodically, the way you have to when you're tracking someone in terrain that can turn ankle-breaking treacherous without warning. The prints were relatively fresh, probably made within the last 12 to 24 hours, based on the sharpness of the edges and the lack of wind fill. Whoever had walked this way had done so recently, which meant if they were in trouble, there was still a good chance of finding them in time to help. The trail led through increasingly difficult terrain, weaving between boulder formations and across small washes where seasonal water had carved channels in the desert floor. The prints stayed consistent, that same purposeful stride. Someone who knew where they were going, or at least thought they did. But there was something about the path that bothered me. Something I couldn't quite articulate at first. It wasn't following any logical route, wasn't heading toward any of the known landmarks or trails in this area, just striking out into the emptiness like the hiker had a specific destination in mind that only they could see. About half a mile from where I'd found the jug, the terrain opened up into a wide valley between 2 ridgelines, the kind of space that makes you feel exposed and small under that vast desert sky. The boot prints continued across the valley floor, still heading northwest, still maintaining that steady pace. But now I noticed something else. Small pieces of trash at irregular intervals, a protein bar wrapper, an empty electrolyte gel packet, a torn piece of duct tape. Not enough to constitute serious littering, but enough to suggest someone had been snacking while walking, leaving a breadcrumb trail either deliberately or carelessly. I collected each piece, bagging them as potential evidence, and continued tracking. The sun was climbing higher now, the temperature rising with it, and I was grateful for my hydration pack and the decades of experience that taught me to respect this environment's ability to kill the unprepared. Whoever I was following, if they'd left that much water behind and were still out here, they were operating on borrowed time. The prints led me to the far side of the valley and up onto a rocky slope that required some scrambling to follow. This was where tracking got harder, the stone holding little evidence of passage except for the occasional scuff mark or disturbed pebble. But I'd been doing this long enough to read the subtle signs, the places where someone had stepped and shifted weight, the scratches on rock faces where hands had grabbed for balance. Whoever this was, they were pushing into terrain that wasn't exactly technical climbing, but definitely wasn't casual hiking either. At the top of the slope, the landscape changed again. A plateau stretched out, dotted with those iconic Joshua trees that give this park its name, their spiky arms reaching toward the sky like they're trying to grab hold of something just out of reach. And there, in a patch of soft sand between two particularly large Joshua trees, I found more prints. Clear, deep, the full boot print visible, including the wear pattern on the heel that suggested someone who pronated slightly when they walked. But these prints were different from the ones I'd been following. These pointed back the way I'd come, back toward the trail and the abandoned water jug. I stood there for a moment, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The outbound prints had brought the hiker up here to this plateau, and now there were inbound prints, heading back in the same direction. Had they turned around, realized they were going the wrong way, and decided to retrace their steps? Except the prints didn't overlay each other the way they would if someone had simply walked out and then walked back along the same route. These were separate tracks, parallel in some places, diverging in others, like two different people had walked this route at different times. But the boot tread was identical, the size was identical, even that distinctive wear pattern on the heel matched perfectly. One person, two sets of tracks, going in opposite directions. I knelt down, examining the prints more carefully, trying to determine which set was newer. In sand, that can be tricky, but there are tells if you know what to look for. The way the edges hold, the amount of drift from wind, the presence of small debris that might have blown into the depression. After several minutes of close examination, I made a determination that troubled me more than the discovery itself. The inbound tracks, the ones heading back toward the trail, were newer than the outbound tracks. This person had walked out here first, spent some time on this plateau based on the various prints scattered around, and then had walked back. But if they'd walked back, where was the water jug I'd found? It had been in the direction of the outbound tracks, not the inbound. Had they dropped it on the way out, then walked back without picking it up? That made no sense. You don't leave water behind in the desert. I kept coming back to that fundamental truth. Not if you're thinking clearly, not if you're in control of your decisions. I stood and followed the inbound tracks, moving back the way I'd come, but now with a growing sense of unease. The tracks led back down the rocky slope, retracing the route almost exactly, but not quite, deviating by a few feet here and there in a way that suggested someone either unfamiliar with the terrain or not paying close attention to where they'd walked before. At the bottom of the slope, the prints continued across the valley floor, and that's where things got stranger. The stride length had changed. Where the outbound tracks showed a consistent, purposeful pace, the inbound tracks were shorter, more hesitant, like someone who was tired or uncertain. And the direction wasn't quite right. Instead of heading straight back toward where the water jug had been left, these tracks meandered slightly, correcting course in small increments like someone navigating by landmark rather than following their own trail back. I stopped and radioed dispatch with an update. "This is getting weird," I said, trying to keep my voice level and professional, even though something about this whole situation was triggering every warning instinct I'd developed over 16 years in this job. "I've got two sets of tracks from what appears to be the same person, same boots, one heading out and one heading back, but the behavioral pattern is different between them. The return tracks show signs of confusion or disorientation. Still no sign of the hiker themselves. Copy that, Morales. Backup is about 15 minutes out. Do you want to wait for them before continuing?" I looked at the tracks leading away across the desert floor, thought about the water jug sitting abandoned, about someone out here potentially confused and lost, even though they were supposedly heading back the way they'd come. Negative. I'm going to keep following these inbound tracks, see where they lead. Something's wrong here, and I'd rather find this person sooner than later. The tracks led me on a winding route that confirmed my suspicion about disorientation. Instead of the straight line you'd expect from someone retracing their path, these tracks wandered, making small corrections and adjustments like the hiker was trying to remember the route but couldn't quite get it right. And then, about 200 yards from where I'd originally found the water jug, the tracks just stopped. Not stopped like they'd reached a rocky patch and became harder to follow. Stopped like they ended in the middle of a perfectly trackable sandy area. One moment there were clear boot prints, the next there was nothing. No indication of where the person had gone, no scuff marks suggesting they'd jumped or climbed, no disturbance in the surrounding vegetation. Just an end point, as if the hiker had simply vanished mid-stride. I circled the area carefully, looking for any signs I'd missed, any explanation for this apparent impossibility. People don't just disappear. There's always evidence of where they went, always some indication of movement. But I couldn't find anything. The tracks led to this spot and stopped, and the desert around me held its secrets in that pressing silence. My radio crackled. "Morales, this is Ranger Jackson. I'm approaching your last known position. What's your status?" "I'm about 300 yards northwest of the water jug location," I replied, "and I've got something I need you to see. These tracks, they're not adding up to anything that makes sense." Ranger David Jackson arrived within minutes. A younger ranger with only 3 years under his belt, but solid training and good instincts. I walked him through what I'd found, showing him the outbound tracks, the inbound tracks, and the point where they simply ended. He examined everything with the same careful attention I had, and I could see his confusion growing to match my own. "This doesn't make sense," he said finally, stating what we were both thinking. "You can't just walk across sand and then stop leaving tracks. There's no disturbance, no sign of backtracking or trying to cover the trail. It's like they just ceased to exist at this point. Which means we're missing something," I said, refusing to accept the impossible. "People don't vanish. They go somewhere, even if we can't immediately see where. We need to expand our search pattern, look for any indication of where this hiker went after this point." We worked systematically, creating a search grid around the endpoint of the tracks, looking for any evidence that might explain what had happened here. And slowly, painstakingly, I started finding small signs. A disturbed pebble here, a faint scuff mark on a rock face there. Suggestions that someone had continued moving but across terrain that didn't hold prints the way sand did. The trail, such as it was, led roughly east, which would eventually bring someone back toward the main trail system but by a circuitous route that added miles to the journey. Following these minimal traces required every bit of tracking skill I possessed, and progress was slow. Jackson stayed close, helping to spot the subtle signs that marked the passage of a human through this landscape. "You ever seen anything like this before?" Jackson asked as we paused to verify a particularly questionable scuff mark. "In terms of weird track patterns, a few times. Dehydration and heat exhaustion can make people do strange things, walk in circles, backtrack for no apparent reason, lose all sense of direction, but this?" I gestured at the carefully recorded evidence on my GPS unit. "This is different. This feels deliberate somehow, like the confusion is serving a purpose, even if I can't figure out what that purpose might be." We continued tracking for another hour, the trail leading us on a winding route that seemed designed to be as difficult to follow as possible. And then, as we crested a small rise, I saw something that made my heart rate spike. A backpack, sitting against the base of a Joshua tree, positioned carefully like someone had set it down intending to come back for it. Jackson and I approached cautiously. The backpack was a standard hiking model, well used but in good condition, with a frame and multiple pockets designed for multi-day treks. I photographed it in place before carefully examining the contents. Water bottles, all empty. Food, partially consumed. A sleeping bag, a small camp stove, a first aid kit, everything you'd need for a solo backcountry hike, all organized and packed by someone who clearly knew what they were doing. And there, in the top pocket, I found a wallet. Inside was a driver's license for a Dustin Phelps, 34 years old, address in Phoenix, Arizona. The photo showed a man with short dark hair and a serious expression, someone who looked physically fit and outdoorsy. But what caught my attention was what was tucked behind the license, a piece of paper with handwritten notes. The notes were cryptic, almost stream of consciousness. The silence here is different. Not absence, but presence. Following the old miner trails, but they don't go where the maps say they should. Water at mile 6, leave some for the return. The Joshua trees point the way, but you have to know how to read them. 3 days to find the source. 3 days to understand. I read the notes aloud to Jackson, who looked as puzzled as I felt. What source is he talking about? And old miner trails. There are abandoned mines in the park, but they're all closed off, too dangerous for public access. I don't know, I admitted. But this is starting to feel less like someone who got lost and more like someone who came out here looking for something specific. The question is what, and whether that search is what got them into trouble. We bagged the backpack as evidence and continued searching the immediate area. The boot prints appeared again in sandy patches, and now they showed a different pattern. No longer the purposeful outbound stride or the confused inbound wandering. These tracks were erratic, sometimes running, sometimes stopping abruptly, sometimes heading in seemingly random directions. The behavior of someone who was either panicking or being pursued, though I couldn't imagine what would be chasing someone out here in broad daylight. We need to call this in as a full missing person investigation, Jackson said, and I nodded agreement. This had gone beyond a simple case of someone hiking off trail. Dustin Phelps was out here somewhere, and based on everything we'd found, he was in serious trouble. I got on the radio and gave dispatch a complete rundown. We've got a confirmed missing hiker, Dustin Phelps, 34, male, from Phoenix. Found his backpack abandoned with empty water bottles, and we're tracking erratic footprints suggesting possible psychological distress or extreme dehydration. We need SAR teams mobilized, and I recommend aerial support if available. This person has been out here at least 24 hours, possibly longer, without water in increasing heat conditions. Dispatch acknowledged and started the machinery of a full search and rescue operation. Within an hour, we'd have teams converging on this area, search dogs, possibly a helicopter for aerial reconnaissance. But an hour was a long time for someone in crisis in the desert, and I wasn't inclined to wait. I'm going to keep tracking, I told Jackson. You stay here, mark this location as our secondary base point, and coordinate with the incoming teams. Guide them to this position, and then we can spread out from here with proper search patterns. Jackson agreed, and I set off following those erratic prints, moving as quickly as I could while still maintaining careful observation. The tracks led me deeper into the backcountry, into sections of the park that saw maybe a handful of visitors per year, places where the desert felt ancient and untouched, where that silence pressed close and heavy. And as I walked, following the desperate footprints of Dustin Phelps, I kept thinking about those notes in his wallet. The silence here is different. Not absence, but presence. What had he meant by that? What had he heard or felt in this desert silence that had driven him to make such strange, dangerous choices? The sun was high overhead now, the temperature climbing into the 90s, and I was acutely aware that every minute that passed decreased Dustin's chances of survival. Heat exhaustion, dehydration, disorientation, any or all of these could be affecting him by now. And out here, in this vast empty landscape where help was measured in hours, not minutes, those conditions could be fatal. The tracks led me to the edge of a small canyon, maybe 30 feet deep, carved by ancient water flow that hadn't seen significant moisture in decades. And there, at the bottom of that canyon, I saw him, a figure in hiking clothes sitting with his back against the canyon wall, completely still. "Dustin Phelps," I called out, my voice echoing off the rock walls. "Park Ranger, can you hear me?" No response. No movement. I radioed my position to Jackson and carefully made my way down into the canyon, using the natural handholds and footholds that erosion had carved into the rock face. All the while, I kept calling out to Dustin, trying to get some response, some sign that he was conscious and aware. When I reached the canyon floor and approached him, the full severity of the situation became clear. Dustin Phelps was alive, but barely, his skin flushed and dry, his breathing shallow and rapid. Classic signs of severe heat exhaustion bordering on heat stroke. His eyes were open but unfocused, and when I checked his pulse it was racing, thready, and weak. "Dustin, can you hear me? I'm Ranger Morales. I'm here to help." I immediately started first aid, getting what water I could into him in small sips, trying to cool him with wet cloths, monitoring his vitals and radioing constant updates to the incoming SAR teams. He was in critical condition, and getting him out of this canyon and to medical care was now a race against time. But even as I worked to stabilize him, even as I focused on the immediate emergency, I couldn't help but notice what he'd been looking at when I found him. The canyon wall was covered in old markings, scratches in the rock that could have been natural weathering or could have been deliberately made. And at his feet, arranged in a pattern that seemed intentional, were small rocks, creating what looked almost like an arrow pointing deeper into the canyon. Dustin's lips moved, barely a whisper, and I leaned close to hear. Had to follow. The silence. Had to see where it leads. Then his eyes closed and he lost consciousness, and all my attention focused on keeping him alive until help arrived. The SAR team arrived within 20 minutes, a testament to how seriously dispatch had taken my reports and how efficiently everyone had mobilized. They brought medical equipment, extraction gear, and the kind of focused professionalism that comes from hundreds of training hours and real-world experience. Getting Dustin out of that canyon was a technical operation that required careful coordination, but we had him on a stretcher and being carried toward the nearest accessible point for helicopter evacuation within 40 minutes of my finding him. I stayed with him the entire time, monitoring his condition and watching for any change that might require immediate intervention. He drifted in and out of consciousness, never fully lucid, occasionally mumbling phrases that didn't quite connect into coherent sentences. The pattern, changes at night. They knew. The old ones knew. His words were fragmented, the rambling of someone whose brain was being cooked by heat and dehydration, but there was an urgency to them that suggested these weren't just random thoughts. The helicopter touched down in a clearing about a mile from the canyon, and within minutes Dustin was loaded aboard and lifting off toward the nearest hospital equipped to handle severe heat-related emergencies. I watched it disappear into the brilliant desert sky, feeling that familiar mix of relief and concern that comes with every rescue. Relief that we'd found him in time, that he was alive and getting the medical care he desperately needed. Concern about what state he'd be in when he recovered, whether there would be permanent damage from the exposure, whether his mind would be clear enough to explain what had happened out here. Once the helicopter was gone, I turned my attention back to the canyon where I'd found him. The SAR team was packing up their equipment, preparing to hike back out, but I asked two of them to stay with me for a more thorough documentation of the scene. Something about this whole situation didn't sit right, and I needed to understand what Dustin had been doing here, what he'd been looking for that had driven him to such dangerous extremes. We descended back into the canyon, this time with better equipment and the leisure to examine things properly without the urgency of a medical emergency. The markings on the canyon wall that I'd noticed earlier were more extensive than I'd initially realized. They covered a section of rock face about 20 feet wide and 10 feet high, a mixture of what looked like deliberate scratches and natural weathering patterns that created an almost language-like appearance. These could be old mining marks, suggested Ranger Marcus Thompson, one of the SAR team members who'd stayed behind. He was in his 50s, had worked in this park longer than I had, and knew its history better than most. There were prospectors all through this area in the late 1800s and early 1900s before the park was established. They'd leave marks to indicate claims, to map their explorations, to communicate with other miners. I photographed the markings carefully, capturing them from multiple angles and with various lighting conditions. Marcus might be right about the mining connection, but there was something about the pattern of marks that seemed more organized than simple directional indicators. They clustered in certain areas, created repetitive shapes, formed what almost looked like a map or diagram if you looked at it from the right angle. The rocks that Dustin had arranged at the base of the wall were still in their pattern, undisturbed by our rescue operation. I documented these as well, noting how they formed a clear arrow pointing deeper into the canyon, toward the west where the canyon narrowed and twisted out of sight. Whatever Dustin had been following, whatever pattern or meaning he'd found in the desert silence, it had led him to this spot and convinced him to mark the direction forward. "Should we follow it?" asked Lisa Kowalski, the other SAR team member, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and good instincts. "See where this arrow points? What's further up the canyon?" I considered it. We had limited daylight left, and the canyon terrain would be treacherous in the dark. But we were here now, equipped and prepared, and I couldn't shake the feeling that understanding what Dustin had been chasing might be important, not just for his case, but for preventing future incidents. If there was something out here that had the power to draw people into dangerous behavior, we needed to know about it. "Let's give it an hour," I decided. We follow the canyon west, document anything unusual, but we turn back well before sunset. I'm not risking anyone else in this terrain after dark. The canyon narrowed as we moved deeper, the walls rising higher on either side until we were walking through a slot barely wide enough for two people to pass abreast. The silence here was profound, our footsteps absorbed by the sand underfoot, our voices sounding strangely muted even when we spoke at normal volume. I understood a little better what Dustin might have meant about the silence being different here. It wasn't just quiet, it was like the air itself was thicker, heavier, dampening sound in a way that felt almost unnatural. We found more markings as we progressed, similar scratches and patterns on the canyon walls, always positioned at regular intervals like mile markers on a highway. And at each marking there were small rock arrangements on the ground, arrows and patterns that confirmed we were following the right path, that this was indeed something Dustin had been tracking. About half a mile into the canyon, the passage opened up into a wider chamber, a natural amphitheater carved by ancient water flow. And here the walls were covered in markings, hundreds of them, creating an intricate tapestry of scratches and symbols that covered every available surface. It was overwhelming, this density of marks, and I found myself turning slowly, trying to take it all in. "This isn't just mining marks," Marcus said quietly, his earlier certainty gone. "This is something else. This is obsessive, deliberate. Someone, or multiple someones, spent serious time down here creating this." Lisa was examining the ground at the center of the chamber, where the sand had been disturbed in a circular pattern, smoothed and shaped almost like someone had been using it as a canvas. "Look at this," she called out, and Marcus and I joined her. The sand had been marked with a stick or finger, creating a detailed diagram that looked like a map. Not of the terrain exactly, but of something, relationships between points marked with circles and connected by lines. I knelt down, studying the sand map carefully. It took me a moment to recognize what I was seeing, but when it clicked, my breath caught. This was a map of the night sky, or more specifically, a map of constellations visible from this location. The circles represented stars. The lines showed the traditional constellation patterns, and small marks indicated specific points of interest or alignment. Dustin was mapping the stars, I said, pulling out my phone to photograph the sand diagram before it could be disturbed. Or following a star map that someone else had created. Look at the way these points align with those markings on the walls. If you were standing here at night and you looked up at specific angles indicated by these marks, you'd be looking at specific stars or constellations. But why? Lisa asked the question we were all thinking. What's the point of creating an astronomical observation site out here in a hidden canyon? There are better locations in the park, more accessible spots with clearer sky views. Maybe that's exactly the point, Marcus suggested. Maybe whoever made this wanted it hidden, wanted it protected from casual discovery. You don't stumble onto this place by accident. You have to know it's here, have to follow specific clues to find it. It's like a secret, passed down through generations of people who knew how to read the signs. I thought about Dustin's notes, about following old miner trails that didn't go where maps said they should, about Joshua trees pointing the way if you knew how to read them. He'd been following clues, piecing together a puzzle that had been deliberately obscured and scattered across the landscape. And this chamber, this astronomical observation point hidden in a remote canyon, was what he'd been looking for. But the question remained, why? What was so important about this specific location and its star maps that it warranted such secrecy? And more pressingly, what had driven Dustin to continue searching even after he'd run out of water, even as his body began shutting down from heat and dehydration? We spent another 30 minutes documenting the chamber, photographing every angle, taking detailed notes, recording GPS coordinates. Then, with the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, we made our way back out of the canyon. The hike out was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about what we'd found and what it might mean. By the time we reached the trailhead and the waiting park vehicles, I was exhausted, dehydrated despite careful water management, and mentally drained from the intensity of the day. But there was no rest yet. I had reports to file, evidence to process, and I wanted to check on Dustin's condition, find out if he was stable enough to answer questions about what had driven him out here. The hospital reported that Dustin was in serious but stable condition, being treated for severe dehydration and heat exhaustion with some concerns about kidney function but overall positive prognosis. He was sedated and wouldn't be available for questioning until the following day at the earliest. So I focused on the paperwork, documenting everything we'd found, organizing the photographs and GPS data into a coherent record of the incident. It was well past midnight by the time I finished and headed home, my small apartment in the town of 29 Palms, just outside the park boundaries. Sleep came quickly despite my churning thoughts, the exhaustion of the day overriding my mind's desire to puzzle through the mysteries we'd uncovered. The next morning brought more questions than answers. I arrived at the ranger station to find my supervisor, Chief Ranger Amanda Reeves, waiting with a concerned expression. "We need to talk about yesterday's rescue," she said, gesturing me into her office. "I've been reviewing your reports and the photographic evidence, and I've got some people who are very interested in what you found in that canyon." "What people?" I asked, settling into the chair across from her desk. "Academic types, archaeologists, anthropologists, some professor from UC Berkeley who specializes in indigenous astronomical practices. Apparently, word got out about your discovery, and there's a lot of excitement about the potential significance." Amanda paused, choosing her words carefully. "There's also been contact from someone claiming to represent the descendants of the original Serrano and Cahuilla peoples who lived in this area before it became a park. They're requesting that the canyon location be kept confidential and protected from public access. I processed this information slowly. The involvement of academics made sense. What we'd found was potentially significant from an archaeological and historical perspective. But the request for confidentiality suggested there was more to this story, cultural or spiritual significance that went beyond simple historical interest. "What about Dustin Phelps?" I asked. "Has anyone contacted him, asked him how he knew about that location?" Amanda shook her head. "He's still in the hospital, still not cleared for interviews, but I did some digging into his background. He's a freelance writer and researcher, focuses on obscure historical sites and indigenous cultural practices. He's written articles for various journals and magazines about lost knowledge, ancient astronomical observations, that kind of thing. My guess is he came across some reference to this canyon in his research and decided to investigate personally. Without proper preparation or notification," I added. "He could have died out there. But he didn't, thanks to you." Amanda smiled briefly before her expression turned serious again. "Look, Sadie, this is going to turn into something bigger than a simple rescue operation. There are going to be competing interests, academic researchers who want access, cultural representatives who want protection, Park Service regulations to navigate. I need you to be the lead on this, work with all the parties involved, help us figure out the right balance between study and preservation." I wasn't thrilled about the prospect of navigating bureaucratic and political complexities, but I understood why Amanda wanted me involved. I'd found the site, I understood the terrain and the circumstances, and I had the experience to make informed recommendations. "I'll do it," I agreed. "But first, I want to talk to Dustin Phelps. I need to understand what drove him out there, what he was really looking for." The hospital cleared me to visit Dustin the following afternoon. He was sitting up in bed, looking pale and worn but alert, with IV lines still feeding hydration and medication into his system. When I entered his room and introduced myself, his eyes showed recognition and something that looked like relief. "Ranger Morales," he said. His voice is still rough from dehydration. "They told me you're the one who found me. Thank you. I know I messed up badly out there." I pulled a chair close to his bed. "You came very close to dying, Mr. Phelps. Another hour or two and we might have been recovering a body instead of rescuing a living person. I need to understand what you were doing out there, why you pushed yourself to such extremes." Dustin was quiet for a moment, his eyes distant as he gathered his thoughts. "How much did you find?" he asked finally. "Did you just find me, or did you find the chamber?" "We found the chamber," I confirmed. "The astronomical observation site, the markings, the star maps, it's all documented. Now I need you to tell me how you knew about it and what it means." He nodded slowly, as if he'd expected this conversation and had been preparing for it during his recovery. "I've been researching indigenous astronomical practices for about 5 years, he began. Not just the well-known sites like Chaco Canyon or the medicine wheels of the northern plains, but the forgotten ones, the locations that were deliberately obscured or lost over time as populations were displaced and cultural knowledge was suppressed. About a year ago, I came across a reference in an anthropologist's field notes from the 1930s. He'd been working with Serrano elders in this area, documenting oral histories before they were lost. One of the elders mentioned a place of listening in what's now Joshua Tree, a canyon where the old people would go to hear the voice of the sky. The anthropologist thought it was metaphorical, just colorful language for a meditation spot, but something about the description caught my attention. I listened as Dustin explained how he'd followed that single reference through archives and historical records, piecing together clues from mining reports, early Park Service surveys, and geological studies. The canyon we'd found wasn't marked on any official maps, had been deliberately excluded from park documentation, perhaps because early rangers recognized it had cultural significance that needed protection. The more I researched, the more convinced I became that this place was real and that it represented something important, Dustin continued. Not just an observation site, but a kind of astronomical calendar, a way of marking time and seasons using the desert landscape as a canvas. The indigenous peoples who lived here before colonization, they were sophisticated astronomers. They understood the sky, tracked the movements of stars and planets, used that knowledge for agriculture, for navigation, for spiritual practices. So you came out here to find it, I said, to verify that the place of listening was real. I came out here to document it, Dustin corrected, to show that this knowledge existed, that it wasn't just primitive superstition or simple stargazing. The precision of those markings in the canyon, the way they align with specific celestial events, it demonstrates a level of mathematical and astronomical sophistication that most people don't associate with pre-colonial indigenous cultures. But you didn't prepare properly, I pointed out. You abandoned your water. You pushed yourself to dangerous extremes. Why? Dustin's expression became troubled, almost embarrassed. Because I got lost in it, he admitted. Once I found the canyon, once I started following the markings and understanding the patterns, it became all-consuming. I spent the first day just documenting, taking notes, trying to map everything out. But then night fell, and I saw what the markings were really pointing to. He paused, and I prompted him to continue. What did you see? The stars, he said simply. Not just looking at them, but understanding them in a way I never had before. From that specific location, at that specific time of year, the constellations aligned with the canyon walls in a way that created this incredible three-dimensional map. The stars above, the marks on the walls, the shape of the canyon itself, all working together to create something that was part art, part science, part spiritual experience. I stayed there all night, watching the sky turn, tracking the movement of stars across the canyon opening. And I realized that I was seeing what those ancient observers had seen, understanding the patterns they'd encoded in rock and sand. It was profound, Ranger Morales. It changed how I understood the universe and our place in it. His voice had taken on an almost reverent quality, and I could see the passion that had driven him to take such risks. But I could also see the danger in that passion, the way it had overridden his common sense and survival instincts. When morning came, I knew I needed to leave, needed to get back to my campsite and resupply, Dustin continued. But I also knew I hadn't documented everything, hadn't fully mapped the system. So I decided to make one more trip deeper into the canyon, follow the markings to their conclusion. That's when I made my mistake. You left your water behind, I said, remembering the jug we'd found near the trail. I thought I'd be quick, just a couple hours to check the deeper sections and then back out. But the canyon system is more complex than I realized. I got turned around, ended up backtracking when I thought I was moving forward. By the time I realized how disoriented I'd become, I was already dehydrated and starting to feel the effects of heat exhaustion. The rest is kind of a blur. I remember trying to navigate back out, remember thinking that if I could just find the main chamber again, I could follow my own tracks back to the trail. But the harder I tried to remember the route, the less certain I became. It was like the canyon was shifting around me, like the landmarks I thought I remembered weren't where they should be. I nodded, understanding what he'd experienced. Dehydration and heat exhaustion cause confusion and disorientation, make the familiar seem strange and the certain seem uncertain. In that state, even experienced outdoors people can become hopelessly lost in terrain. They should be able to navigate easily. Eventually, I ended up in that smaller canyon where you found me. Dustin finished. I remember seeing more markings, remember trying to decode them, thinking they might show me the way out. And then everything just faded, and the next thing I knew, I was waking up in this hospital bed. We talked for another hour, Dustin providing details about his research and what he'd found in the canyon, me explaining the interest from academic and cultural groups in studying and protecting the site. He was genuinely remorseful about the danger he'd put himself in and the resources that had been expended on his rescue, but he was also eager to help document and preserve what he'd discovered. "This place is important," he said, as I was preparing to leave. "Not just historically, but as proof that the indigenous peoples of this region had sophisticated scientific knowledge that deserves recognition and respect. Whatever happens with the site, however it's managed going forward, I want to make sure their contribution is acknowledged, that this isn't just appropriated as some mysterious ancient discovery without giving credit to the cultures that created it." I respected that perspective, appreciated his awareness of the cultural sensitivities involved. As I drove back to the park, I thought about everything Dustin had told me and what it meant for the future of the canyon site. There would need to be careful balance between study and preservation, between making this knowledge available to researchers while respecting the wishes of indigenous descendants who might have spiritual or cultural connections to the location. Over the following weeks, I worked with Amanda and various stakeholders to develop a management plan for the canyon. The location would remain undisclosed to the general public, with access restricted to permitted researchers working in consultation with Serrano and Cahuilla cultural representatives. A team from UC Berkeley would be allowed to conduct a comprehensive survey and documentation, with the understanding that any publications would properly acknowledge the indigenous origins of the site. Dustin Phelps made a full recovery and became a consultant on the project, his research and insights proving valuable in understanding the historical context of the canyon. He published an article about his experience that walked a careful line between sharing the significance of what he'd found while respecting the need for confidentiality about its location. The article generated interest in the broader academic community about indigenous astronomical practices in the American Southwest. For me, the case of Dustin Phelps and the Hidden Canyon became a reminder of why I'd become a ranger in the first place. This job isn't just about maintaining trails and assisting tourists, though those are important parts of it. It's about being a steward of places that hold history and meaning, about protecting what's valuable even when that value isn't immediately obvious, about understanding that the desert's silence can hold secrets worth preserving. I still patrol the backcountry trails of Joshua Tree regularly, still keep an eye out for hikers who might be pushing themselves too far or making dangerous choices. But now, when I'm out in that vast empty landscape, when that profound desert silence presses close, I think about what Dustin said about the silence being different, about it being presence rather than absence. Maybe he was right. Maybe that silence is the accumulated weight of centuries, the echo of all the people who've looked up at these same stars and tried to understand their place in the universe. The indigenous astronomers who created that canyon observatory, they understood something fundamental about the relationship between Earth and sky, about how paying attention to patterns and cycles can reveal truths that aren't immediately obvious. 3 months after Dustin's rescue, I received a package in the mail. Inside was a book, a published collection of his research on indigenous astronomical sites throughout the Southwest. He'd inscribed it, "To Ranger Morales, who saved my life and helped preserve something more important than any one person. The desert keeps its secrets, but you helped make sure this one would be remembered. Thank you." I keep that book on my desk at the ranger station, a reminder of a case that started with abandoned water and strange footprints and ended with the rediscovery of ancient knowledge. And sometimes, when the station is quiet and I'm alone with my paperwork, I'll flip through its pages and think about those markings in the hidden canyon, about star maps written in stone and sand, about the sophisticated science practiced by people who are too often dismissed as primitive. The desert silence isn't empty. It's full of stories if you know how to listen, and part of my job, I've come to understand, is making sure those stories aren't lost to time and ignorance. Whether it's helping a delirious hiker survive his obsessive quest, or working to protect and preserve what that quest uncovered, it's all part of the same larger purpose, honoring this land and the people who understood it long before it was ever called a national park. There's a particular quality to the light in Joshua Tree just after dawn that you don't find anywhere else. It comes in low and golden, turning the desert into something that looks almost painted. The shadows long and sharp-edged, the rocks glowing amber and rust. In that light, the landscape transforms from the harsh, unforgiving terrain of midday into something gentler, almost welcoming. It's a lie, of course. The desert is never gentle, never forgiving. But it's a beautiful lie, and one I've learned to appreciate in my 8 years as a ranger here. I'm Colin Westbrook, 36 years old, and I've spent most of my adult life in wild places. I started with seasonal work in Yellowstone right out of college. Moved through various parks and forests before landing here at Joshua Tree. Something about this place grabbed hold of me and wouldn't let go. Maybe it's that quality of light, or the stark beauty of the landscape, or the way the silence here feels like it has weight and substance. Whatever it is, I can't imagine working anywhere else now. The morning of April 3rd started like any other. I was scheduled for a backcountry patrol, checking on some of the more remote areas of the park that don't see much traffic. These routes take you far from the popular tourist spots, out into terrain that requires four-wheel drive and a good understanding of desert navigation. It's the part of the job I love most, being out in that vast emptiness with nothing but the landscape and my own thoughts for company. I was maybe 10 miles into the patrol, following an old mining road that dated back to the early 1900s when this area was still being prospected for gold and other minerals. The road was rough, more of a suggestion than an actual maintained route, with washouts and rockfalls requiring constant attention to navigate. I'd just crested a small rise when I saw it, a dark shape off to the side of the road that didn't belong in the natural landscape. As I got closer, the shape resolved into a vehicle, a Jeep Wrangler, and it was in trouble. The Jeep had rolled, coming to rest on its driver's side against a cluster of rocks. The passenger side was facing up toward the sky, and I could see immediately that no one was moving inside. I stopped my truck, grabbed my radio and emergency kit, and approached carefully. "Dispatch, this is Westbrook. I've got a rolled vehicle on the old Henderson Mine Road, approximately 10 miles from the southern boundary. Single vehicle, no obvious occupants visible from my position. Approaching to assess." I kept my voice calm and professional, but my heart rate had already kicked up. Rolled vehicles in the backcountry are serious business. The remoteness of the location, the difficulty of access for emergency services, the potential for severe injuries, all of it adds up to situations that can turn critical fast. The Jeep was a newer model, maybe 2 or 3 years old, painted in desert tan that was now covered in dust and scrapes from the roll. The windshield was cracked but intact, and as I circled around to look in through the upward-facing passenger door, I could see the interior was empty. No driver, no passengers, no bodies trapped in the wreckage. That was good news, but it raised immediate questions about where the occupants had gone and in what condition. I tried the passenger door and found it unlocked. Opening it carefully, I looked down into the interior of the vehicle. The driver's seat was empty, the seatbelt unbuckled and hanging loose. The steering wheel showed some damage consistent with impact, and there was blood on the airbag that had deployed. Not a massive amount, but enough to indicate someone had been injured in the rollover. The interior was scattered with the usual road trip debris. An empty coffee cup in the center console, a jacket wadded up in the back seat, a pair of sunglasses on the dashboard. But 3 items caught my immediate attention. On what was now the floor, but had been the driver's side door, there was a detailed topographical map of the park, unfolded and marked with handwritten notes and route lines. Next to it lay an empty water bottle, the large gallon size that serious desert travelers carry. And there, still clipped to the sun visor, was a handheld radio. I carefully climbed partway into the vehicle to retrieve the radio. It was a decent model, the kind that could reach Park Service frequencies, and the battery indicator showed it still had some charge. The volume was turned low, but when I brought it closer I could hear faint static. More importantly, I could see that the transmit button had been pressed recently. There was still a slight depression visible where someone's thumb had held it down. I checked the radio's memory function, and there it was. A partially transmitted message from approximately 6 hours earlier, around midnight based on the timestamp. The message was brief, cut off mid-transmission. Eerie? Berta. The voice was female, strained, and the message ended abruptly, as if the transmission had been interrupted or the radio had lost power. But it was those 3 words that sent a chill down my spine, despite the already warming morning air. Eerie, Berta, someone is here. Not I need help or I'm injured or any of the standard distress calls you'd expect from someone who'd just rolled their vehicle in the desert. Someone is here. The implication was clear. The driver hadn't been alone at the time of the transmission. Or at least they believed they weren't alone. I immediately got on my own radio. Dispatch Westbrook, I've got an abandoned, rolled Jeep, signs of injury to the driver, and a partial distress transmission from approximately 6 hours ago. The transmission is unusual, suggests the driver may have felt threatened or observed someone else in the area. I need license plate run, registered owner information, and SAR mobilization. Also, requesting any reports of other vehicles or persons in this area overnight. While dispatch worked on getting me information, I continued my examination of the scene. The Jeep's roll appeared to have been caused by the driver losing control on the rough road, possibly swerving to avoid something. The tracks leading up to the point of rollover showed erratic steering, and there were fresh gouges in the road surface where the vehicle had fishtailed before going over. But what caught my attention was what the tracks didn't show. There was no evidence of another vehicle being involved, no tire marks suggesting someone had been chasing or forcing the Jeep off the road. Whatever had caused the driver to lose control, it appeared to have been their own reaction to something, not external interference. I photographed everything: the position of the vehicle, the damage pattern, the interior layout, the radio and its cryptic message. Then I began searching the immediate area for signs of the driver. Boot prints were visible in the sandy soil near the driver's side of the Jeep, suggesting someone had climbed out after the crash. The prints were small, probably women's size 7 or 8, and they showed signs of someone moving unsteadily, possibly injured or disoriented. The prints led away from the crash site, heading roughly northeast toward a cluster of rock formations about 200 yards distant. I followed them carefully, marking my own trail with flagging tape so I could retrace my steps. The desert here was a mix of sand and rock, with scattered Joshua trees and cholla cactus creating a landscape that was both beautiful and treacherous. Dispatch came back with information. Westbrook, that vehicle is registered to Mara Whitfield, 31 years old, address in San Diego. She checked in at the west entrance 3 days ago, told the ranger she was planning some backcountry exploring and photography. No one has reported her missing yet. We're mobilizing SAR and trying to contact her emergency contacts. Mara Whitfield. Now, the missing driver had a name, an identity. I continued following her tracks, moving carefully through terrain that offered plenty of opportunities for a turned ankle, or worse. The boot prints showed she'd been moving with purpose, not wandering randomly, suggesting she had a destination in mind or was following something she could see. About 100 yards from the crash site, I found the first blood drops. Small, spaced far apart, consistent with someone bleeding from a head or facial wound but still mobile. The drops continued along the trail, and I could see where Mara had stopped at one point, where the boot prints showed her standing still for what must have been several seconds based on how deep the impressions were. What had she stopped to look at? I scanned the area, trying to see what she might have seen from that position. The rock formations she seemed to be heading toward were more visible from here, their distinctive shapes standing out against the morning sky. And there, leading toward those formations, were more tracks. But these weren't boot prints. These were drag marks, like something heavy had been pulled across the sand. My pulse quickened. Drag marks could mean many things, most of them bad. Someone pulling an injured person, someone pulling equipment or supplies, or in the worst case, predator activity, though there wasn't much in this area large enough to drag a human-sized object. Mountain lions occasionally passed through, but they were rare and typically avoided humans. I followed the drag marks, radio in hand, ready to call for immediate backup if I found what I feared I might find. The marks led toward a gap between two large boulders, a natural passage that opened into a small, sheltered area behind the rock formation. And there, I found something that made no sense at all. The sheltered area was maybe 20 feet across, protected from wind and sun by the surrounding rocks. The sand here showed clear signs of recent disturbance, but what had been disturbed was bizarre. Someone had created a pattern in the sand, a series of lines and circles that looked almost like a diagram or map. It was too deliberate to be random, too organized to be the work of wind or animals. And in the center of that pattern sat a backpack. Not Mara's, based on the size and style. This was a larger pack, the kind a serious hiker or prospector might carry. It was old, the fabric faded and worn, and when I carefully opened it, I found it contained exactly what you'd expect from someone exploring the desert. Water bottles, some dried food, a first aid kit, and a notebook. The notebook was what made my hand start shaking slightly as I flipped through it. The entries were dated going back 3 weeks, and they documented someone's exploration of this area of the park. The handwriting was male, neat, and methodical, recording observations about the terrain, about old mining sites, about places where the desert showed signs of previous human activity. But the last few entries, dated just 2 days ago, showed a change in tone. Found something unusual in the Henderson area. Tracks that don't make sense, leading in circles. Someone else has been here, moving at night. Need to be careful. And then the final entry, dated yesterday. They're watching. I know they are. Found my camp disturbed. Supplies moved. Setting up here for the night. If something happens, if I don't make it back, look for the pattern in the sand. It means something. I stood there in that sheltered space, holding a stranger's notebook and trying to piece together what had happened here. Someone, a male hiker or explorer, had been in this area for weeks. He'd noticed something unusual, felt threatened or watched, and had apparently set up in this location as some kind of defensive position or observation post. And now his pack was here, but he wasn't, and Mara Whitfield had followed drag marks to this exact spot before apparently continuing on. The drag marks continued beyond the sheltered area, leading deeper into the rock formations, But now they were joined by boot prints, Mara's prints, following alongside the drag marks rather than making them. She hadn't been dragging something. She'd been following something or someone who was dragging something. I got back on the radio. Dispatch. The situation is more complex than a simple vehicle accident. I've found evidence of a second missing person, male, possibly been out here for several weeks. The driver of the rolled Jeep appears to have been following this person's trail after her accident. I'm continuing to track, but I need SAR here ASAP, and I recommend we treat this as a possible criminal investigation as well as a rescue operation. Copy that, Westbrook. SAR is inbound, ETA 30 minutes. Sheriff's Department has been notified and is sending a deputy. Do you feel unsafe continuing alone? I considered the question carefully. Did I feel unsafe? The rational part of my brain said there was no evidence of active threat, no indication that whatever had happened here was ongoing. But the instinctive part, the part that had kept me alive in the backcountry for years, was screaming warnings. Something about this whole situation felt wrong, felt dangerous in a way I couldn't quite articulate. I'm continuing, I decided, but I'm staying on open radio, continuous updates. If you lose contact with me for more than 5 minutes, send everything. I followed the tracks deeper into the rock formations, the passage narrowing until I was squeezing between stone walls that rose 20 feet on either side. The tracks continued through this narrow gap, and I could see where someone had scraped against the walls, leaving fabric threads caught on rough edges. The gap opened into a larger area, a natural amphitheater created by erosion and geological processes over millions of years. And there, in the center of that amphitheater, I found them. 2 people sitting back to back against a large boulder. Mara Whitfield, based on her resemblance to the license photo Dispatch had sent to my phone, and a man I didn't recognize. Both were alive, both were conscious, and both were looking at me with expressions of profound relief mixed with something that looked like fear. "Ranger," Mara said, her voice hoarse and strained. "Thank God we didn't think anyone would find us in time." I approached carefully, assessing both of them for injuries. Mara had a nasty gash on her forehead, explaining the blood at the crash site and in her tracks. It had been bandaged with strips torn from a t-shirt, crude but effective first aid. The man next to her, middle-aged with graying hair and a weathered face, had what looked like a badly sprained or possibly broken ankle. His boot removed and the joint swollen to twice its normal size. "I'm Ranger Westbrook," I said, kneeling beside them and pulling out my first aid kit. "I found your Jeep, Mara, and I've got search and rescue on the way. Can you tell me what happened? And who is this?" "James," the man said before Mara could answer. "James Corrigan. I've been out here for 3 weeks doing research on old mining sites. Got injured 2 days ago, stupid mistake, and I've been stuck ever since." "I found him," Mara continued. "After my crash. I followed his drag marks, thought maybe it was an animal at first, but then I found his camp and realized someone was in trouble. I tried to radio for help, but my radio died mid-transmission." "Your radio is back at your Jeep," I said. "I heard the message. Eerie, Burada. Someone is here. You were telling Dispatch you'd found someone." Mara nodded. "I was trying to report that I'd found an injured hiker, but the words came out wrong. I hit my head pretty hard in the rollover and I was confused, disoriented, and then the battery died and I couldn't transmit again." It made sense. The mysterious message wasn't a threat or a warning about someone dangerous being in the area. It was a confused attempt to report finding James, garbled by head injury and shock. The menacing tone I'd read into it was a product of my own interpretation, not the actual situation. "But the notebook," I said, looking at James. The entries about being watched, about someone disturbing your camp. What was that about? James looked embarrassed. I was getting paranoid, he admitted. Being alone out here for 3 weeks, isolated, probably not eating as well as I should have been. I started seeing patterns that weren't there, imagining things. The disturbance at my camp was probably just wind or animals, but in my state of mind, it felt like something more sinister. When I injured my ankle and couldn't walk, that paranoia got worse. I treated their injuries as best I could with my field kit while radioing updates to the incoming SAR team. Both Mara and James were dehydrated and exhausted, but their injuries, while serious, weren't life-threatening now that help had arrived. Within 40 minutes, we had a full rescue operation underway, with additional rangers, medical personnel, and a sheriff's deputy all converging on the location. The extraction took several hours. James had to be carried out on a stretcher, his ankle too damaged to bear weight. Mara could walk with assistance, though the head injury meant she needed careful monitoring for signs of concussion or worse. By early afternoon, both were in ambulances heading to the nearest hospital, and I was back at the crash site with the sheriff's deputy, documenting everything for the official report. Hell of a situation, Deputy Martinez said as we photographed the rolled Jeep. Could have gone a lot worse if you hadn't been on patrol out here this morning. Could have gone worse if Mara hadn't been tough enough to keep moving after her crash, I corrected. She probably saved James's life. Another day or two without water in this heat, and he wouldn't have made it. The tow truck arrived to extract the Jeep, a complex operation given the remote location and the vehicle's position. While they worked, I walked the site one more time, making sure I hadn't missed anything important. That's when I found it, caught in some brush about 50 feet from where Mara's tracks had first left the crash site. A piece of paper, torn and dirty, with handwriting I recognized from James's notebook. It was a note, apparently written shortly before his ankle injury. If anyone finds this, I've been exploring the old mine sites east of Henderson Road. Some of them show recent disturbance, signs that someone else has been here recently. I'm not sure what they were looking for, but they've been digging in areas that had been sealed off decades ago. Might be illegal salvage, might be something else. Coordinates below. I photographed the note and bagged it as evidence. So James's paranoia hadn't been entirely unfounded after all. There had been someone else in the area, someone conducting what sounded like illegal mining operations. That would explain some of the signs he'd noticed, the disturbances and tracks that had made him feel watched and threatened. This was information that would need to follow up. Investigation by law enforcement to determine if someone was indeed conducting illegal mining operations in the park. But that was a problem for another day. For now, my immediate concern had been resolved. 2 people who'd been in danger were safe, rescued, and receiving medical care. As I drove back to the ranger station in the late afternoon light, I thought about that partial radio message that had started this whole investigation. Biri, Burda. Someone is here. In Turkish, words that Mara had probably learned from family or friends and had slipped into under stress and confusion. She'd been trying to report finding James, trying to get help for both of them, but the message had come out garbled and her radio had died before she could clarify. How different this day could have gone if I'd interpreted that message differently, if I'd approached with more caution or waited for backup instead of immediately tracking into the formations. The outcome had been good, but the margins were thin. A few hours later, a few degrees hotter, a different set of circumstances, and I might have been recovering bodies instead of coordinating rescues. The investigation into the illegal mining activity started the very next morning. Deputy Martinez coordinated with federal land management agencies since Joshua Tree is national park land, and by mid-morning we had a team assembled that included myself, 2 other rangers, a Bureau of Land Management investigator, and a specialist from the FBI's Environmental Crimes Unit. The FBI involvement surprised me until I learned that illegal mining on federal land, especially when it involves protected areas, falls under their jurisdiction and can carry serious federal charges. We returned to the area where James Corrigan had been conducting his research, armed with his coordinates and notes about the disturbances he'd observed. The day was already heating up, promising to be another scorcher, but we started early enough to get several hours of work done before the worst of the afternoon heat set in. I led the team along the same route I'd taken the previous day, pointing out the relevant locations and explaining what I'd found. The old Henderson mine area consisted of several shafts and tunnels that had been dug in the early 1900s during one of the region's periodic gold rush frenzies. Most had produced little or nothing, and they'd been officially sealed in the 1970s when the Park Service acquired the land. The seals were meant to keep curious tourists from getting themselves killed exploring unstable tunnels, and disturbing them was a federal offense even before you considered the mining aspect. What we found confirmed James's observations. 3 of the sealed mine entrances showed clear signs of recent disturbance. The concrete caps that had been poured over the openings had been broken through, and the resulting holes were large enough for a person to enter. Around each entrance, the sand and rock showed vehicle tracks, boot prints, and evidence of excavation equipment having been used. "This is recent," said Agent Sarah Holbrook, the FBI investigator kneeling to examine one of the broken seals. "Within the last month, maybe 6 weeks. Whoever did this used some serious tools, probably a jackhammer or concrete saw. That's not casual trespassing, that's organized and deliberate." "But why?" asked Ranger Thomas Kirk, one of my colleagues who'd joined the investigation team. "These mines were tapped out over a century ago. There's no gold left here, nothing worth the risk of federal charges." Agent Holbrook stood, brushing dust from her knees. "That's what we need to figure out." Modern illegal mining usually falls into a few categories. People looking for minerals that weren't economically viable to extract in the past, but are valuable now with modern technology and prices. People looking for gems or semi-precious stones that early miners missed because they were only focused on gold. Or people who've convinced themselves there's still a major deposit that was somehow overlooked. "There's another possibility," I said, remembering something from James's notebook. James mentioned in his notes that some of the disturbances seemed focused on areas that had been sealed off. What if whoever's doing this isn't mining at all? What if they're looking for something specific that they believe was hidden or left behind in these old tunnels? The team exchanged glances. It was a theory that opened up different investigative avenues, the possibility of theft or recovery of historical artifacts, or even the pursuit of old legends about lost treasure or cached valuables. The desert Southwest was full of such stories, most of them embellished over decades of retelling, but occasionally one turned out to have a grain of truth. We spent the next several hours documenting the disturbed sites, taking photographs and measurements, collecting samples of tool marks and any other evidence that might help identify who had done this. Agent Holbrook set up motion-activated cameras at each location, sophisticated units that would capture images of anyone returning to the sites. She also deployed ground sensors that would alert us if vehicles approached the area. "If they come back, we'll know about it," she said with satisfaction. "And we can have a response team here within 30 minutes. These cameras are cellular-enabled, so we get real-time alerts." While the evidence collection continued, I hiked out to check on the area where I'd found Mara and James the previous day. The sheltered spot behind the rock formation was still marked with that strange pattern in the sand that had puzzled me yesterday. Looking at it now with fresh eyes and better light, I could see it more clearly. It wasn't random. It was a map, crude but recognizable, showing the layout of the Henderson mine area with the various shafts marked. But there were additional marks on this sand map, symbols or notations that I couldn't interpret, I photographed everything and made my way back to where the investigation team was working. Agent Holbrook examined my photos with interest, then pulled out her phone and started comparing them to satellite imagery of the area. "These marks," she said, pointing to the symbols on my photos, "they correspond to specific locations that aren't part of the historical mining record. Look here," she zoomed in on her satellite map. "This symbol matches with a spot about half a mile northeast of the main mine complex. And this one," she swiped to show a different angle, "corresponds to a canyon entrance that's partially hidden by rockfall." "James was mapping something," I said, the realization hitting me. Not the official mine sites, but something else. Secret locations or hidden areas that he'd discovered in his weeks of exploration. "We need to check these sites," Deputy Martinez said, looking at the time. "But we're running out of daylight hours. I recommend we mark these locations, secure the area, and come back tomorrow with a full team and proper equipment." Agent Holbrook agreed, but I could see she was eager to investigate immediately. The law enforcement mentality, the drive to pursue leads while they're hot, was warring with practical considerations about safety and preparation. In the end, practicality won, and we spent the remaining daylight hours securing the area and planning the next day's investigation. I drove back to the ranger station as the sun was setting, painting the desert in those rich amber and crimson colors that make this landscape look like something from another world. My phone rang as I was pulling into the parking lot. It was the hospital, informing me that both Mara and James were stable and had been asking to speak with me when I had time. I drove to the hospital in 29 Palms, arriving just as visiting hours were ending. The staff made an exception given the circumstances and the official nature of my visit. I found Mara first, in a private room with her head bandaged and an IV line feeding hydration and medication. She looked tired but alert, and she smiled when she saw me enter. "Ranger Westbrook," she said, her voice stronger than it had been yesterday. "They told me you're the one who found us. I never got to properly thank you." "You don't need to thank me," I replied, pulling a chair close to her bed. "I was doing my job, but I do need to ask you some questions if you're feeling up to it. About what happened out there, and about James Corrigan." Mara nodded carefully, mindful of her head injury. "I'll tell you everything I remember, though some of it is still fuzzy. The concussion, the doctors say." She walked me through her experience, starting with her decision to explore the backcountry areas of Joshua Tree for her photography work. She specialized in landscape and nature photography, sold prints through galleries and online, and Joshua Tree's unique geology and flora made it a favorite location. She'd obtained the proper permits for backcountry access and had planned a 3-day solo trip to capture images in areas that saw little tourist traffic. "The first 2 days went perfectly," she said. "I got some amazing shots, found some locations that were exactly what I'd been looking for. But on the 3rd day, that's when things got strange." She'd been driving along the old Henderson Road when she noticed vehicle tracks leading off toward what looked like abandoned mining sites. As a photographer, she was always interested in old structures and historical locations, so she'd decided to investigate. That's when she'd seen evidence of the disturbed mine entrances, the broken seals, and signs of recent activity. "I took some photos," Mara continued. "I thought it might be something the Park Service should know about, possible vandalism or illegal activity. But as I was photographing the 3rd site, I heard something, voices, coming from inside one of the tunnels. She'd hidden behind some rocks, uncertain whether whoever was in the tunnel was dangerous or just other explorers who might be in need of help. After several minutes, 2 people had emerged from the tunnel, both carrying backpacks and what looked like mining equipment. They'd been too far away for her to see clearly or hear what they were saying, but their behavior had seemed furtive, constantly looking around as if worried about being observed. "I stayed hidden until they left," Mara said. They had a truck parked about a quarter-mile away, drove off heading west. I got photos of the truck, but the license plate was covered in mud. I couldn't make out the numbers. After they left, I decided I should report what I'd seen and get out of the area in case they came back. But on her way back to the main road, she'd noticed James's camp. It looked abandoned but recent, with supplies scattered around and signs that someone had left in a hurry or under duress. Concerned that the people she'd seen might have done something to whoever had been camping there, she'd started looking for signs of what had happened. "That's when I found his trail," she said. "The drag marks leading away from the camp. I thought maybe he'd been injured by those people, maybe attacked or left behind. I followed the marks and eventually found him in that amphitheater area, barely conscious and severely dehydrated." She'd done what the first aid she could with the supplies from James's camp, then had tried to hike back to her jeep to radio for help. But in her haste and the growing darkness, she'd taken a wrong turn and ended up on a different section of the rough road. When she'd seen lights in the distance, she'd thought it might be the people from the mine coming back, had panicked and swerved, causing her jeep to roll. "After the crash, I was disoriented," Mara continued. "I knew I needed to get help for James. Knew he wouldn't survive much longer without water and medical care. I managed to get my radio working long enough to try to call for help, but I was confused, couldn't think straight. I meant to say I'd found someone who needed help, but the words came out wrong, and then the battery died." "The Turkish phrase," I said. "Biri burada, someone is here," she nodded. "My grandmother was Turkish. I grew up hearing the language. Under stress, especially with a head injury, I sometimes slip into Turkish without realizing it." I tried to explain in English, but the radio cut out before I could finish. After the failed radio attempt, Mara had made the difficult decision to go back to James rather than try to find help on foot in the dark. She'd retraced her path, found him again, and they'd spent the night together in that amphitheater, taking turns staying awake in case the people from the mine came looking for them. "James told me about what he'd been investigating," Mara said. "About the illegal mining, and about something else, something he'd discovered in the old records that suggested there might be more to these mines than just gold prospecting." Before I could ask her to elaborate, there was a knock on the door. A nurse entered with medication, and I took the opportunity to check my phone. There was a message from Agent Holbrook. "Need you to call Asa P., New Development." I excused myself from Mara's room and stepped into the hallway to return the call. Agent Holbrook answered on the first ring. "Westbrook, one of our cameras just triggered. We've got 2 vehicles at the mine site, 3 individuals currently entering one of the disturbed tunnels. Sheriff's Department is mobilizing, and I'm heading there now. I need you to meet us there. Your knowledge of the terrain will be valuable." My heart rate kicked up. "I'm at the hospital in 29 Palms. I can be there in 45 minutes. Make it 30 if you can. We're setting up a perimeter, but I don't want to move in until we have enough personnel to secure all potential exit routes. These tunnels connect underground in ways that aren't fully mapped." I made it in 35 minutes, pushing my truck as fast as I dared on the rough desert roads. The staging area was a controlled chaos of law enforcement vehicles with deputies from the Sheriff's Department, additional FBI agents, and several rangers all coordinating their approach. Agent Holbrook briefed me quickly. 3 subjects, 2 males and 1 female based on body shape and movement patterns. They entered the main tunnel about 20 minutes ago, and thermal imaging suggests they're still inside, probably at least 100 feet down. We've secured all known exits, but as you said, these old tunnels are incompletely mapped. The main shaft goes down at a 45-degree angle for about 200 feet, I said, pulling up the historical mining records on my tablet. Then it branches into at least 3 separate galleries, but there are also several ventilation shafts that come up in unexpected places, Some of them have probably collapsed over the years, but some might still be passable. We studied the maps and satellite imagery, identifying possible escape routes and positioning teams accordingly. The plan was to wait until the subjects emerged from the tunnel and apprehend them in the open, rather than risk a confrontation in the unstable underground environment. But as an hour passed with no movement, Agent Holbrook grew concerned. "They should have come out by now," she said, checking her watch. "Either they've found something that's taking longer to extract than usual, or they've realized we're here and they're looking for another way out." That is when we heard it. A distant, rumbling sound that seemed to come from beneath our feet. The ground shook slightly, just enough to feel but not enough to knock anyone off balance. Agent Holbrook's radio squawked, multiple teams reporting the same phenomenon. "That was a collapse," I said, the terrible realization hitting me. Part of the tunnel system just gave way. We moved quickly, throwing caution aside in favor of potential rescue operations. A team entered the main tunnel with proper safety equipment, while others spread out to check the ventilation shafts and other potential openings. I went with the group checking the eastern ventilation system, old, brick-lined shafts that hadn't been accessed in decades. The third shaft we checked showed fresh disturbance, the brick cap partially removed and a rope ladder descending into darkness. I called it in and carefully climbed down, my headlamp illuminating ancient brick walls slick with mineral deposits. At the bottom, the shaft connected to a horizontal gallery that was partially blocked by a recent collapse. And there, on our side of the collapse, were two of the three people who'd entered the tunnel. A man in his 50s and a younger woman, both covered in dust and clearly shaken but not seriously injured. They didn't resist when we secured them, seemed almost relieved to be caught rather than trapped underground. "There's another one," the man said immediately. "Martinez, he was deeper in when the collapse happened. We got out, but he's still in there. We couldn't reach him." A full rescue operation was immediately initiated. It took 6 hours of careful work, removing rubble and shoring up the unstable tunnel, before we reached the third person. He was injured, a broken leg, and various contusions, but alive. By the time we had all three out and in custody, the sun was rising on a new day, and I was running on adrenaline and bad coffee. The interrogations revealed the full scope of what had been happening. The three individuals, led by the older man, who identified himself as Marcus Trent, had indeed been conducting illegal mining operations. But they hadn't been looking for gold or gems. They'd been searching for something specific, something Trent claimed was documented in old mining records from the 1890s. The Henderson mine wasn't just about gold. Trent insisted during his interview, which I was allowed to observe. The original prospector, a man named Cyrus Henderson, found something else down there, something he tried to hide, sealed up in one of the side galleries. It's documented in his personal journal, which I acquired from his great-grandson. Agent Holbrook was skeptical. "And what exactly did Henderson find that was worth risking federal charges and potentially your life to recover?" Trent leaned back, wincing from his injuries. "Artifacts, pre-Columbian artifacts, ceremonial items made of gold and turquoise. Henderson found evidence that the indigenous peoples who lived here hundreds of years ago had used these tunnels for religious purposes, had left offerings and sacred objects deep underground. He took a few pieces for himself but felt guilty about it, sealed the rest back up. His journal has a map showing exactly where." It sounded like the fever dream of a treasure hunter, the kind of story that led people to make foolish and dangerous choices. But Agent Holbrook promised to investigate the claims, to determine if there was any historical validity to Trent's story, or if it was just elaborate justification for criminal activity. As for James Corrigan, I visited him before leaving the hospital. He was in better shape than Mara, his ankle stabilized and his color much improved. He confirmed much of what Mara had told me, adding details about what he'd observed during his weeks of exploration. I knew something was going on with those mines, he said. The disturbances were too organized, too focused. I was planning to report it to the Park Service, but then I injured myself and everything went sideways. If Mara hadn't found me— He trailed off, the alternative too grim to articulate. She saved your life, I said simply, and nearly died doing it. That's worth remembering. He nodded solemnly. I intend to. Once I'm healed up, I'm going to make sure her story gets told properly. People should know about what she did, the courage it took to help a stranger even after her own accident. 3 days later, I returned to the Henderson mine area one final time. The disturbed tunnels had been properly sealed with new, reinforced caps, and warning signs had been posted throughout the area. The motion cameras would remain in place for several months, monitoring for any further illegal activity. Agent Holbrook's investigation into Trent's claims was ongoing, but preliminary analysis suggested his story about pre-Columbian artifacts was likely a fabrication, wishful thinking built on misinterpreted historical documents. I stood at the entrance to the main shaft, now sealed behind 2 feet of concrete and rebar, and thought about everything that had happened here. 2 people who'd nearly died because one was chasing a foolish dream and the other had tried to stop him from dying in pursuit of it. 3 others now facing serious federal charges for crimes committed in pursuit of a treasure that probably never existed. The desert keeps its secrets. That's something I've learned in my years here. The silence I'd appreciated that morning when I found Mara's rolled Jeep, that same silence that had seemed so profound and meaningful, it didn't discriminate. It held wisdom and foolishness equally, protected the valuable and the worthless with the same indifferent persistence. Mara's broken radio message, Biri Burda, someone is here, had launched a chain of events that ended with rescues, arrests, and the prevention of further illegal activity. But it had started with confusion and fear, with a head injury making language slip sideways, with a desperate attempt to communicate that had barely succeeded. I drove back to the ranger station as the afternoon heat built toward its daily crescendo. There would be reports to finish, evidence to organize, testimony to provide when the case went to trial. But the immediate emergency was over. The people who'd been in danger were safe, and the law enforcement machinery was grinding forward toward justice, or at least accountability. That evening, I sat at my desk going through the last of the paperwork when my phone rang. It was Mara, calling from her home in San Diego where she'd been released to recuperate. Ranger Westbrook, I hope I'm not bothering you. I just wanted to thank you again, properly, now that my head is clear. You're not bothering me, I assured her. How are you feeling? Better. Doctors say the concussion was serious, but I should make a full recovery. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about James, and about my decision to help him. I keep wondering if I did the right thing, if I should have just tried to get help instead of going back to stay with him. You did the right thing, I said without hesitation. You made the choice that saved his life, even though it put yours at additional risk. That's the definition of doing the right thing. She was quiet for a moment. The photos I took, of the mine sites and the people I saw, I've been asked to provide them as evidence. I'm going to, but I wanted to ask what happens to them after the trial. They'll be part of the court record, I explained. Public documents once the case is concluded. Why? Because some of them, Mara said slowly, are actually quite beautiful. The light hitting those old structures, the way the desert has reclaimed them. I'm thinking about doing a series, documenting the history of mining in Joshua Tree, the scars it left, and how the landscape is healing them. With proper permits and Park Service approval, of course. I smiled. I think that's a great idea, and I'm sure we can work something out for access and documentation. The story of what happened out there, both the historical mining and the modern illegal activity, it's worth telling properly. We talked for a few more minutes before saying goodbye. After hanging up, I sat at my desk thinking about stories and silence, about the way the desert holds both memory and mystery in equal measure. The broken radio that had started this investigation was now evidence in a federal case, but its message, garbled and incomplete, had communicated exactly what it needed to. Someone is here. Someone needs help. Don't give up on us. In the end, we hadn't given up. We'd found them, saved them, stopped the illegal activity, and brought some measure of order to a situation that had been spiraling toward tragedy. It was good work, the kind of work that reminded me why I'd chosen this career, this place, this life of service in one of the planet's most unforgiving and beautiful environments. The desert silence returned to the Henderson mine area, broken only by wind and the occasional call of ravens. But it wasn't empty silence anymore, not for me. It was full of the echoes of what had happened there, full of the stories of people who'd pushed themselves to extremes for various reasons, some noble and some foolish. And those stories, preserved in reports and memories and eventually in Mara's photographs, would serve as reminders of both what to seek in the desert and what to fear. 6 months after the incident, I found myself standing at the Visitor Center gallery, looking at Mara Whitfield's photographs displayed on the walls. The exhibition was titled Scars and Silence, A History of Mining in Joshua Tree, and it had drawn more attention than anyone had anticipated. News outlets had picked up the story, intrigued by the combination of rescue drama, federal investigation, and artistic documentation of a hidden piece of park history. Mara stood beside me, no longer wearing bandages, her hair grown long enough to cover the scar from her head injury. She'd fully recovered physically, though she admitted the psychological impact had taken longer to fade. The nightmares about being trapped in the desert, about James dying because she couldn't get help, those had persisted for months before gradually losing their grip. "What do you think?" she asked, gesturing at the photographs. "Does it do justice to the story?" I studied the images carefully. She'd captured something essential about the Henderson mine area, the way human ambition had scarred the landscape and then been swallowed by the desert's patient persistence. Rusted equipment half buried in sand, mine entrances sealed with concrete, nature slowly reclaiming what had been taken. And in several of the photos, the subtle evidence of the recent illegal activity, the broken seals and disturbed ground, served as a reminder that the cycle of exploitation and consequence continued into the present. "It's honest," I said finally. "It doesn't romanticize the mining era or the people who were out there illegally. It shows the reality, the damage and the beauty coexisting." "That's what I was going for," Mara said with satisfaction. "I didn't want to make the historical miners into villains or heroes, just people who came here looking for something and left marks that outlasted their ambitions. And the modern treasure hunters, same thing. Marcus Trent and his team, they weren't evil, just desperate and deluded." The trial had concluded 2 months earlier. Marcus Trent and his associates had pleaded guilty to multiple federal charges, including illegal mining on federal land, destruction of protected historical sites, and endangering public safety. The sentences were substantial, several years in federal prison, reflecting the seriousness of their crimes. But Agent Holbrook had told me privately that the judge had shown some leniency because no one had been killed, and because Trent's testimony had led to the recovery of several legitimate historical documents that he'd acquired through questionable means. The journal he'd claimed belonged to Cyrus Henderson turned out to be real, though his interpretation of its contents had been wildly optimistic. Henderson had indeed found some small artifacts in the tunnels, likely left by indigenous peoples who'd used the caves for shelter or ceremonies. But there was no massive cache of gold and turquoise, no hidden treasure waiting to be recovered. just a few items that Henderson had felt guilty about taking and had vaguely referenced in his private writings. Those writings were now part of the park's historical collection, properly archived and available to researchers. They provided valuable insights into both the mining era and the indigenous use of the area before colonization. In a strange way, Trent's criminal obsession had led to the preservation and proper documentation of information that might otherwise have remained hidden in private collections. James Corrigan had recovered from his ankle injury and had returned to his research, though with a much more cautious approach. He'd written a paper about the historical mining sites that had been published in a regional history journal, and he'd been careful to credit both Mara and the Park Service for their roles in bringing the story to light. He and Mara had stayed in touch, an unlikely friendship forged in shared trauma and survival. "He's coming to the exhibition opening," Mara told me, "flying in from Denver, where he's doing research on mining sites in Colorado. I think he wants to see these photos, to have some visual documentation of the place that almost killed both of us." The exhibition opening that evening was well attended. Local residents, Park Service personnel, academics interested in the history, and tourists who'd heard about the story all filled the visitor center. I stayed in the background mostly, uncomfortable with the attention that came from being part of a high-profile rescue and investigation. But several people sought me out to ask questions, to hear first-hand accounts of what had happened. Agent Holbrook attended, representing the FBI's interest in the case, but also, I suspected, genuinely interested in seeing how the story had been translated into art. She spent a long time studying one particular photograph, an image of the main mine entrance with its new concrete seal, taken at sunset when the light turned everything gold and shadow. "This is the one," she said when I joined her. "This is the image that captures what it's all about, the desire to dig into the earth, to extract what's valuable, to leave a mark, and then the earth sealing itself back up, patient and inevitable." "Mara has a good eye," I agreed. "She sees things that most people walk past. Like James Corrigan lying injured in the desert," Holbrook said. "Most people in her situation would have driven straight to safety after that crash. The head injury, the confusion, the fear, all of it would have pushed a normal person toward self-preservation. But she went back to help someone she didn't know, someone who might have already been dead." It was a quality I'd thought about often in the months since the rescue. What makes someone choose to help when helping is dangerous and difficult? What internal compass points them toward others even when their own survival is in question? Mara had that quality, and it had saved James's life at serious risk to her own. As the evening progressed, I found myself in a quiet corner with James, both of us nursing drinks and watching the crowd circulate through the gallery. His ankle had healed well, though he admitted it still bothered him in cold weather or after long hikes. "I've been meaning to ask you something," James said, after we'd talked about his current research for a while. "That sand map I made at my shelter, the pattern with the symbols. You found it, photographed it. Did you ever figure out what I was trying to document?" "The locations of disturbed mine sites," I said, "and some other spots that you'd marked as potentially significant." He shook his head. "That's what I thought I was doing. But when I look at the photographs now, with a clearer head, I realize I was documenting something else entirely. I was mapping my own mental deterioration, the way paranoia and isolation were distorting my perception." I looked at him with interest. "What do you mean?" "Those symbols, they don't actually correspond to real locations," James explained. "Or, at least not in any logical way. I was out there alone for 3 weeks, not eating properly, not sleeping well, letting my imagination run wild with theories about being watched and followed. The map I created in the sand was really a map of my own fears and delusions, given geographic form." It was a profound piece of self-awareness, the kind that comes from surviving something that should have killed you and then having to reconcile with your own role in nearly causing that death. "Does that bother you?" I asked, "knowing that you weren't as rational as you thought you were?" "It scares me," James admitted. "Because I'm a researcher, someone who prides himself on objective analysis and clear thinking. Realizing that I was so far gone mentally that I'd created an entire paranoid narrative around what was probably just wind and wildlife disturbing my camp, it makes me question my judgment." "But it also taught you something," I suggested. "About your own limits, about the importance of not working in isolation, about recognizing when your environment is affecting your mental state." He nodded slowly. "True. And it's made me a better researcher in the long run. Now, I always work with a partner, or at least maintain regular contact with someone who can check in on me. No more weeks of solo work in remote locations, no matter how interesting the research site." We were interrupted by Mara joining us, her face flushed with excitement from the evening's success. "The curator just told me they want to extend the exhibition for another 2 months," she said. "And there's interest from a gallery in San Francisco about mounting a show there as well. This is becoming bigger than I ever imagined." "You deserve it," James said warmly. "These photographs are important work, not just artistically, but historically and culturally. You've documented something that needed to be documented." The three of us stood together, an unlikely trio brought together by accident and crisis, now bound by shared experience and mutual respect. I thought about that moment 6 months ago when I'd crested the rise and seen Mara's rolled Jeep, had no idea what I was about to walk into. If I'd been an hour later on my patrol, if the radio message had been clearer and I'd approached with different assumptions, if any number of small factors had been different, we might not all be standing here now. The next morning, I returned to my regular duties, the exhibition already feeling like it belonged to a different chapter of my life. But as I drove the backcountry roads on patrol, I found myself looking at the landscape differently. Each old mine site, each abandoned structure, each piece of historical debris wasn't just trash or eyesore anymore. It was evidence of human stories, of dreams and failures, of ambitions that had played out against the desert's indifferent eternity. I stopped at the Henderson mine area, now firmly secured and monitored. The motion cameras were still in place, though they rarely triggered anymore except for wildlife passing through. The concrete seals were already weathering, taking on the patina of the desert environment. Give it another 50 years and they'd look like they'd always been there. Just another layer of human marks slowly being absorbed into the geology. My radio crackled. Dispatch calling with a routine request to check on a reported disabled vehicle on one of the main tourist roads. I acknowledged and started driving toward the location, falling back into the familiar rhythms of the job. This was what most of my days looked like. Routine patrols and minor problems. The unglamorous work of maintaining a park and keeping visitors safe. But every ranger has their stories. The days that were anything but routine. The situations that tested training and instincts and sometimes just plain luck. The incident with Mara and James would be one of mine. A story I'd tell new rangers as both cautionary tale and reminder of why we do this work. Because, at its core, being a ranger isn't about the dramatic rescues or the federal investigations. It's about being present in places that most people only visit briefly, about understanding these landscapes well enough to notice when something's wrong, about being willing to walk into uncertain situations because someone might need help. That broken radio message, garbled and incomplete, had been enough. 3 words that could have meant anything but meant exactly what they needed to mean. Someone is here. Someone needs help. Come find us. And we had. The system had worked the way it's supposed to work, with training and coordination and determination coming together to prevent tragedy. I reached the disabled vehicle, helped the tourists with their overheated engine, and sent them on their way with advice about desert driving and the importance of carrying extra water. Routine stuff, but no less important for being routine. These small interventions, these minor assists, they prevented people from becoming the next emergency, the next rescue operation, the next dramatic story. As I drove back toward the ranger station at day's end, I thought about Mara's exhibition title, Scars and Silence. It captured something essential about this landscape and the human relationship with it. We leave scars, intentionally and unintentionally, through mining and development and simple passage through fragile ecosystems. And the silence absorbs it all, patient and non-judgmental, slowly eroding our marks until they become indistinguishable from the natural weathering of stone. But the silence isn't empty. It's full of stories if you know how to listen, full of history and mystery, triumph and tragedy, wisdom and foolishness. And sometimes, very occasionally, that silence is broken by a crackling radio transmission, 3 words cutting through static. Eerie, Burda. Someone is here. And when that happens, we respond. We always respond. Because that's the job. That's the commitment we make when we put on the uniform and take responsibility for these wild places. We go into the silence, into the unknown, into situations where outcomes are uncertain, and we bring people home. The sun was setting as I pulled into the ranger station, painting the sky in those spectacular colors that make Joshua Tree one of the most photographed landscapes in America. I filed my daily report, locked up my equipment, and headed home with the satisfaction of another day completed. Another shift where nothing catastrophic had happened. But my radio stayed on my belt, charged and ready, monitoring the frequency. Because you never know when the silence will be broken, when someone will need help, when the training and preparation will suddenly become critically important. That's the nature of this work. Long periods of routine punctuated by moments of crisis, and you have to be ready for both. Mara's broken radio sits in an evidence locker somewhere, its battery long dead, its case cracked from the impact of the rollover. But the message it transmitted lives on in reports and memories and now in the story I've told here. A reminder that communication doesn't have to be perfect to be effective, that sometimes 3 confused words are enough, that the will to help and the commitment to respond can overcome a lot of obstacles. Someone is here. Someone needs us. We're coming to find you. That's the promise we make to everyone who enters these wild places, whether they know it or not. And as long as rangers like me keep our radios on and our eyes open, as long as we stay ready to walk into the silence when it calls for help, that promise will be kept. The desert keeps its secrets, but it doesn't keep them forever. And sometimes, when the silence breaks with a desperate transmission, when the unknown suddenly becomes urgently real, we're there to bridge the gap between crisis and resolution, between fear and safety, between being lost and being found. That's the job. That's the calling. And despite the paperwork and the routine and the occasional terror of situations spiraling toward tragedy, I wouldn't trade it for anything.